Long before cities glowed in the night, before furnaces hummed in workshops, before temple courtyards flickered with steady ritual flames, before clay turned hard in the heat of kilns, and long before any human hand understood what fire truly was, the world existed in a kind of quiet that didn't have a name. Not darkness in the frightening sense, not silence in the unsettling sense, just a world where nothing yet burned, a world where warmth came only from the sun during the day, and cold moved gently across the land when night returned. People lived in this world for countless generations, watching storms gather, rivers swell, animals migrate, and seasons circle back again. They knew wind and water and soil. They knew hunger and comfort. They knew danger and safety, but they did not know flame. Not yet. The earliest humans experienced life through patterns. They watched clouds to predict weather. They followed animal tracks. They learned which plants healed and which harmed. They made tools from stone shaped by pressure and time, but without fire there was a limit to what they could transform. Meat remained raw. Nights remained long. Metal remained locked inside rock. Clay remained soft. The world was solid and cool, patient and unchanging. It was a place shaped entirely by natural forces that moved without human guidance. This was the world before Gibil's presence was ever imagined. When early people looked across landscapes stretching farther than their eyes could follow, they saw nothing that responded to them in the way fire later would. Water moved on its own. Wind moved on its own. Animals moved on their own. Nothing transformed because a person wished it to. Nothing changed because a person interacted with it. People existed as part of nature, not yet capable of reshaping it. The first whisper of a divine flame began not with the appearance of fire itself, but with the human awareness that the world contained forces waiting to be understood. The oldest ancestors of humanity lived alongside lightning, volcanic glow, and the faint shimmer of burning branches struck by natural sparks. They saw fire from a distance before they ever approached it. A storm might pass overhead, releasing a sudden flash that struck a tree. The next day, smoke rose in thin lines above the canopy. Animals kept clear. Birds altered their paths. Early humans watched from afar, unsure whether to approach the strange phenomenon or avoid it completely. Fire behaved unlike anything else. It consumed without moving. It grew without limbs. It produced warmth without breath. It gave off light that reminded them of the sun, but with a personality far different from the sky. At first, fire frightened them. They could see its glow long before they could understand its behaviour. It flickered in unpredictable patterns. It made sounds they had never heard, crackling, snapping, hissing. It made shadows dance strangely across the ground. Everything about it challenged their understanding of the world. But in those early moments, curiosity worked quietly beneath fear. There was something compelling about a force that moved even when the world around it stood still. When fire appeared naturally after lightning, volcanic events, or rarely through the friction of falling branches, early people approached it in cautious circles. They watched animals respond to it. Predators avoided it. Prey fled before it. Nothing challenged it. That alone made fire feel powerful. It wasn't a living creature, yet it commanded a kind of respect normally reserved for large beasts. It wasn't water, which could be approached carefully. It wasn't wind, which could be felt but not seen. Fire was visible and alive in a way no other natural force had been. It consumed wood the way hunger consumed strength, yet its appetite left behind something entirely new: ash, charcoal, warmth, and the lingering scent of smoke carried by wind. The first humans to cross the boundary between observing fire and touching its influence did so slowly. They felt the warmth from afar. They reached out with sticks. They noticed that the closer they came, the warmer the air became. Warmth itself must have been astonishing. Night had always been cold. The world cooled quickly after sunset, and people survived by huddling together or retreating to sheltered spaces. But fire changed this. A single flame provided warmth to an entire group. Warmth was not only comfort, it was safety. It was the difference between surviving the night and succumbing to cold. The more they observed fire, the more they learned that it responded to fuel. If they placed a branch near the edge of a flame, the fire grew. If they placed a green branch, it resisted. If they placed a dry one, it caught quickly. Patterns formed, and once humans recognized patterns, they began moving closer to fire's companionship. These early interactions laid the foundation for Gibil's earliest presence, long before his name existed. The relationship between fire and humanity wasn't born in myth. It was born in these humble moments of discovery, moments when the world revealed something astonishing and people listened. Before sparks existed in the deliberate sense, before people knew they could create fire at will, they learned how to preserve it. Firekeepers emerged not because of ritual at first, but because of necessity. Fire was precious. It was rare. If it burned out, it might take days or weeks before another natural source appeared. A firekeeper's role began as practical survival. They shielded flame from wind, fed it with dry wood, and carried embers wrapped in leaves or bark when the group moved from one place to another. These embers glowed faintly at first, but they contained the promise of fire waiting to be reborn. People protected them with as much care as they protected food or tools. This act of preserving flame became one of the earliest responsibilities that connected humanity to something larger than themselves. Fire demanded attention. It demanded consistency. It rewarded understanding and punished carelessness. These qualities made fire feel less like an object and more like a presence. People didn't yet imagine a god in the flame, but they treated it with a respect usually reserved for something living. This respect nurtured the first seeds of mythic thinking. Anything that required such attentiveness, that offered so much in return, and that behaved with such distinct personality, seemed to deserve a name eventually. It seemed to deserve recognition. The earlier stories about fire were not recorded. They lived in quiet observations shared between parents and children. A parent pointing toward a distant glow said something simple. Light. Warm? Be careful. These were the first teachings of fire. Over time, those teachings became more elaborate. The glow of fire explained nighttime safety. The smoke explained direction of wind. The ashes explained what remained after transformation. Fire taught without speaking. It demonstrated without instruction. And people learned. When groups began gathering around fire at night, something else began to change. Not just the environment, but their minds. Firelight allowed people to see each other clearly after sunset. Facial expressions, gestures, and shared moments became visible in ways the darkness had once hidden. The world grew larger at night because of fire. Conversations expanded. Stories could be told. Plans could be made. Fire extended the boundaries of human experience. It shaped social structure, communication, and early forms of culture. It created time that would not have existed without illumination. People didn't yet have clocks or calendars, but they had firelight to measure the hours. As these patterns continued, fire began to occupy a place in human imagination that no other natural force had held. Water flowed, but it did not glow. Wind moved, but it did not warm. Earth supported life, but it did not flicker. Fire did something unique. It transformed. It took one thing and turned it into another. It revealed the inside of things. It changed their shape. It made them more durable or more fragile. It separated what was useful from what was not. This power of transformation made fire feel like the beginning of knowledge. Eventually, people began connecting fire to the idea of origin itself. If flames transformed objects, then perhaps an ancient flame transformed the world. If fire revealed what lay within materials, then perhaps there was a fire that revealed what lay within creation. If fire had a personality, then perhaps that personality belonged to something beyond the physical flame. These early thoughts laid the groundwork for Gibil's eventual story. But before a god could be imagined, fire had to first prove itself worthy of reverence. and it did so by being the most transformative force early humans encountered. The moment humans learned to create fire intentionally marked one of the most important turning points in their development. It didn't happen instantly. Knowledge accumulated gradually, observing sparks when stones struck, noticing heat generated through friction, understanding that dry materials ignited more easily, discovering that certain minerals produce stronger sparks. Trial after trial, mistake after mistake, humans inched closer to the discovery that they could call fire into existence. When that moment arrived, whether through striking flint or spinning wood until smoke appeared, the world shifted permanently. Before that moment, fire had been a gift of nature. After that moment, it became something humans could invite, shape, and maintain. The leap from observing fire to creating it gave them a new kind of control over the world. They no longer had to wait for storms or natural disasters to bring flame. They no longer had to fear losing fire entirely. They could light it whenever it was needed, as a warm companion, a tool of survival, a force of transformation. That was the true beginning of deliberate flame, and in that moment, fire stopped being a mystery and became an extension of human ability. This ability did something profound. It made people reflect. When fire arrived suddenly from storm or volcano, it felt unpredictable, powerful, and external. But when humans learned to create fire themselves, they began to imagine that flame might have a source beyond nature, something that recognized human hands and responded to human intention. Myths form most easily when people understand the behavior of something, but not the mechanism behind it. Fire fit this description perfectly. It responded to technique, but the reason it did so remained invisible. People saw results, but not reactions. They learned that fire could be guided, but not why it behaved the way it did. These gaps in understanding became the space where stories grew. People began wondering whether fire had an origin as ancient as the earth itself, whether it had been placed in the world deliberately, whether something guided its behaviour. They saw fire warm without asking, protect without thought, destroy without anger, and transform without judgment. The attributes they observed seemed to belong to a balanced presence, something that helped humanity learn, grow, and persist. It didn't take long for fire to gain a spirit, then a personality, then a place among the earliest divine figures imagined. Before the name Gibil ever existed, people already recognized a pattern in the flame. It responded to human care. It taught through consistency. It revealed what was hidden. It shaped materials and influenced survival. They didn't imagine a god in fire because they wanted a myth. They imagined a god in fire because the flame behaved like a guide long before they had words for the idea. The earliest myths of a fire spirit or fire presence were simple. They didn't have complex stories or elaborate genealogies. They expressed gratitude for warmth and safety. They expressed caution for the dangers of uncontrolled flame. They expressed awe at the transformation fire made possible. This was the first whisper of a divine flame, not an elaborate deity, not a named god, but the recognition that fire carried meaning the way no other natural force did. Over time, as settlements grew into towns and towns grew into cities, these early impressions of fire evolved. People built hearths, forges, and kilns. They used fire to create tools, cook food, shape pottery, and perform rituals. Fire became woven into daily life, and with each new generation, the stories around fire became more structured. Names were given, roles were defined. Fire took on a guardian presence, a transforming presence, a teaching presence. That presence eventually became Gibil, but his earliest form was not a god with a defined lineage or temple. He began as the first whisper of meaning in a world where nothing yet burned. He was the moment humanity recognized that fire was more than heat. He was the recognition that transformation carried purpose. He was the sense that something in the flame watched, listened, and responded. In those earlier sparks, before myths were carved into clay, before rituals were organised, before priests interpreted smoke, Gibil's story began. Not in temples or workshops, but in the quiet awe of the first flame ever tended by human hands, glowing steadily in a world that had never known such light. It's strange how something as familiar as fire can feel both ordinary and otherworldly at the same time. A candle on a nightstand, a stove warming soup, the quiet glow of a lantern on a winter evening. These are small, calm pieces of fire. But behind them is something older, something powerful, something that once shaped entire civilizations and inspired stories about beings who could command it like a tool or a companion. And among the oldest of those stories is the tale of Gibil, a god whose birth wasn't gentle or quiet, but forged out of heat and celestial motion. A figure who belonged equally to the sky and the earth, to creation and to destruction, to light and to the dark places where fire first revealed what the world looked like. Gibil's story begins long before cities existed, before tablets recorded myths, before humans had words to describe what they were feeling when they saw lightning strike a tree and turn it into a beacon. It begins in a world where people stood at the edge of night, frightened and fascinated by the smallest spark. Imagine early humans watching flames dance for the first time, not understanding the chemical reactions behind them, but sensing something alive in the way the light moved. They would have stared at the heat rising through cool air and wondered if this thing was a creature, a spirit, or the breath of something greater. Those early impressions shaped everything that came after, and when civilizations began forming their pantheons, fire needed a guardian, a source, and a personality. In Mesopotamia, that source was Gibil. The ancients described him as being born from the very forces that shape the world. Not quite sky, not quite earth, but a joining of the two. Heat that rose upward and starlight that reached downward, a child of motion and intensity. His birth wasn't recorded as a single moment the way human births are. It was more like an emergence, a recognition that fire was more than a tool. It was something that revealed, transformed, and demanded respect. People gave it a name because giving a name made it safer, or at least more familiar. Gibil became that name, and with it came a sense of reverence for the phenomenon they depended on but could never fully control. To imagine Gibil's birth the way the ancients did, picture a world darkened by long nights and illuminated only by stars and occasional bursts of lightning. When lightning hit Earth, the result must have seemed like a message, a piece of the heavens striking the soil to leave a temporary sun behind. That was where they saw Gibil. Not just in the flame itself, but in the collision that made it possible. Fire felt like it came from somewhere important. It acted with purpose. It moved with intent. It refused to stay still. The stories say Gibil emerged from this meeting of sky fire and earth matter. The spark wasn't random. It was a birth cry. When scribes eventually wrote down what had already lived for generations in oral tradition, they didn't describe Gibil growing up the way human beings do. They described qualities, behaviours, traits that explained what fire was. Gibil was restless but not chaotic. He had a role and knew it. Fire doesn't wander aimlessly. It follows patterns, consumes what can be consumed, transforms what it touches, and shapes the world in ways that can be planned for or feared. The stories gave these movements to Gibil himself. He became the personality of the flame, the one who rose and fell with the wind, who strengthened with fuel, who faded when starved, and who could either warm a home or destroy a city. Unlike some gods who were born into conflict or rivalry, Gibil's birth was less dramatic and more essential. He existed because fire existed, and fire in the early world was everything. It protected people from predators, it cooked food, it hardened clay, it softened metal, it revealed the night, It turned cold caves into places where families could gather. Without fire, nothing about civilization would have taken shape in the way it did. Gibil's birth was a way of acknowledging that truth. Instead of being a god of one region or one people, he represented something universal, something shared by all human groups even before they knew each other existed. In the earliest tablets that mention him, Gibil is described as being made of pure radiance. That phrasing stands out because the ancient Mesopotamians didn't use metaphors loosely the way modern language does. For them, radiance was a tangible property, something that could be observed, felt, and feared. To call Gibil radiant wasn't poetic, it was descriptive. Fire glows, it produces lines of light across walls, it shows movement in the shadows, it flickers in ways that look almost deliberate. People must have watched flames long enough to start seeing patterns in the way they swayed. Gibil's personality came from those observations. He was the glow that pushed back darkness, but also hid danger inside it. He was the warmth that made nights safer, but also made people dependent on a force they didn't always understand. His birth story continued to evolve as civilizations grew more complex. Priests began defining his role with more precision. He wasn't only the embodiment of fire, he was the spark that began creation, a symbol of beginnings, a reminder that everything new starts with energy. Fire changed raw materials into something useful. It turned clay into pottery, ore into metal, meat into nourishment. Those transformations turned Gibil into more than a natural force. He became a god associated with invention, craft, and progress. His birth wasn't an isolated event from the distant past. It was ongoing, happening every time someone struck flint, lit a lamp, or watched embers rise from a furnace. This idea made Gibil feel alive, not in a dramatic or frightening way, but in a steady, reliable presence. People saw him in the hearth, in the forge, in the kiln. They imagined he was watching, guiding, or at least acknowledging their work. The stories about his birth emphasized that he came into being for a reason. Humans needed fire, and fire needed a guardian who could be honored, respected, and occasionally invoked when the flames didn't behave as expected. One detail that appears often in descriptions of Gibil's birth is the connection between heat and order. At first glance, fire seems chaotic. The way flames twist and curl makes it appear unpredictable. But to the ancient world, fire was one of the most structured forces they knew. It followed rules, it required specific conditions, it responded to the environment, it had boundaries. They saw that fire couldn't exist without the right combination of air, fuel, and ignition. That dependency made fire feel alive in a different way than animals or humans. It was a living force that needed care. Gibil's birth reflected that idea. He wasn't a creature of randomness. He was shaped by balance, shaped by environment, shaped by a relationship between heaven and earth that had to be maintained. As myths developed, the storytellers began to describe Gibil as having a dual heritage. Part of him belonged to the earth, because fire consumes earthly materials. Part of him belonged to the sky, because lightning, sunlight, and celestial heat all seem connected to the origins of flame. This dual identity explained why fire could be both helpful and dangerous. Heavenly forces were powerful, earthly forces were necessary. Fire occupied a place between them. Gibil became the bridge, the mediator, the one who understood both sides. His birth reflected the moment when those two forces met and created something neither could produce alone. There's a detail in some later Babylonian interpretations that adds another layer to his birth. They described fire as the youngest of the elements, not because it was physically new, but because it was constantly being born. Every time a flame appeared, Gibil was reborn. Every spark was a sign of his existence. This perspective meant that his birth wasn't a single moment, but an eternal process. It created a sense of continuity that fit well with how the ancients viewed the cycles of nature. Just as the sun rises each day, Just as rivers flood and recede, just as seasons shift, fire appears and disappears. Gibil's birth mirrored that cycle. He was always new, always emerging, always becoming. Even the places where fire appeared influenced how his birth was described. For example, in some myths, volcanoes were seen as places where gods of heat and flame had their origins or dwelling places. While Gibil wasn't specifically a volcano god, the image of molten earth rising must have reinforced the belief that fire was connected to powerful forces beneath the surface. The same was true for desert heat, kilns used for pottery, and the glow of metalwork. Every environment that produced heat became part of his story. His birth was everywhere heat appeared. He wasn't confined to a single shrine or region. Fire transcended borders. So did he. When priests spoke of Gibil, they often emphasized his craftsmanship. This wasn't just a symbolic trait. Fire was essential for making tools, shaping metal, and building cities. Gibil's birth was directly tied to the process of creating civilization. People depended on fire the way they depended on air and water. Without fire, none of the advancements that define human progress would have been possible. His existence represented the beginning of those innovations. The moment when humans learned to harness fire was, in mythic terms, the moment when Gibil was born into human awareness. Whether or not people believed he existed before, that didn't matter. The important part was that Gibil appeared in their stories when they needed him most. The idea that a god could be born from an experience rather than an event is something Mesopotamian mythology handles in a very grounded way. Gibil's birth wasn't seen as supernatural in the sense of being impossible. It was supernatural in the sense of being awe-inspiring. Fire was a miracle that people could create, but not fully control. It had rules, but also a will of its own. His birth story helped people understand why fire acted the way it did. By giving fire a personality, they gave themselves a way to predict and regulate it. If fire was a god, then it deserved offerings, prayers, and respect. If it misbehaved, there were rituals to calm it. If it helped, there were ceremonies to thank it. Over time, Gibil's birth also began to symbolize renewal. Fire doesn't just destroy, it clears space, it enriches soil, it prepares land for new growth. Ancient people were observant. They saw that after a wildfire, plants often returned stronger. After a field burned, the next harvest might flourish. Gibil's birth absorbed that meaning too. He wasn't just a god who came from heat and heaven. He was a god who appeared in moments of transformation. His arrival marked the start of something new, the beginning of a cycle, the opening of a path. Gibil's birth story grew more layered as centuries passed. Scribes added symbolism that reflected their evolving understanding of the world. Some described him as being born from the breath of the stars, a phrase that sounds poetic but was likely meant to describe the mysterious light that came from above. Others called him the child of the glowing earth, a reference to the heat that comes from deep below. Instead of choosing between these origins, the myths kept both. Fire needed the heavens. Fire needed the earth. Gibil needed both, and he was shaped by the interaction between them. This dual nature explains why Gibil never took on the more volatile attributes of some fire deities in other cultures. He wasn't depicted as unpredictable or violent. He wasn't a destroyer who delighted in chaos. Instead, he was portrayed as steady, watchful, and useful. His birth story reflects that tone. He wasn't born during a war between gods. He wasn't born out of anger or conflict. He was born because the world needed something that could transform the raw materials of life. His existence was purposeful from the beginning. As the myths expanded, his birth began to include the idea of instruction. Fire teaches. It reveals. It shows how materials react. It displays results instantly. Ancient people learned by watching it. Gibil's birth story incorporated this quality. He became a guide, someone who existed not just to shape the world, but to help humans learn how to shape it too. His birth represented the moment when knowledge became possible, when a tool became a teacher, when a force became a partner. Even after civilization shifted, merged and faded, the image of Gibil's birth remained meaningful. The idea that fire comes from a union between earth and sky continued to influence how people understood the world. And while his presence became quieter in later periods, the core of his birth story never disappeared. People still relied on fire, they still respected it, they still saw something alive in it. Gibil remained, even if not always by name. His birth wasn't the beginning of a heroic journey or a dramatic conflict. It was the recognition of a force that shaped the world, a force that could create, protect, transform, and sometimes destroy. Fire was essential, and so the god of fire was essential. Gibil's birth was humanity's way of acknowledging the deep relationship between environment, necessity, and survival. And as the world changed, the understanding of his origins adapted with it. Scribes wrote new versions. Priests described his nature differently depending on the needs of their communities. But the constant remained. Gibil's birth represented the first moment when fire became something humans could live with rather than run from. Something they could depend on. Something they could use to build a future. His birth wasn't loud or violent. It was steady. It was transformative. It was a moment that never stopped happening because every flame was a continuation of that first spark. Every hearth was an echo of the moment when heat and heaven met and created something that would shape the world. And because fire never truly stays still, Gibil's story naturally leads into everything he came to symbolize: creation, craftsmanship, innovation, protection, renewal. All the roles he would later take on grew from the moment he first appeared. His birth was only the beginning, and the world that formed around him continued to change along with every new flame that lit the darkness. The next step in his story reveals how that spark began shaping not just nature, but the people who tended it, watched it, and eventually learned to build entire civilizations around its glow. For as long as people have listened to stories about gods, fire has never simply been a tool. It has always carried weight. It has always felt important, even in its smallest, quietest forms. A single flame trembling on a wick, a small ember lingering in a fire pit, a glow under cooling coals. These details might seem tiny in the scale of human history, yet ancient people looked at them and saw responsibility. They saw life. They saw something that needed tending. And that sense of responsibility shaped the way they understood Gibil. After they imagined the moment he was born from heat and heaven, they began to picture what he did afterward. And one of the earliest roles they gave him was that of a guardian. Not the kind who carried a spear or roared commands, but the kind who remained steady, consistent and watchful over something the world could not afford to lose. The sacred blaze wasn't an object or a singular fire. It was the idea that fire itself was precious, not only because it illuminated the dark or warmed cold nights, but because it held the potential for transformation. When people saw raw materials turning into something new, they understood that fire was a force that could reshape the world. It changed clay into pottery. It shaped metal into tools. It preserved food. It hardened bricks. It brought light into places that had never been lit before. All these transformations made fire something more than a natural phenomenon. It became the creative spark, a gift that allowed humans to participate in shaping their environment. So when they began to describe Gibil as the one who guarded this spark, they were giving form to the idea that some things are too important to be left alone. Fire has always needed guidance. It doesn't run on its own the way rivers do. It doesn't fall from the sky with regularity the way rain does. It depends on conditions. It depends on fuel. It depends on care. You can't simply light a fire and expect it to behave. Ancient people saw this immediately. They watched flames respond to wind, moisture, and attention. They saw how fire could be coaxed, strengthened, redirected, or extinguished. They learned that it responded to human involvement more than many natural forces did. That trait made fire feel closer to a companion or a co-worker, than a distant or untouchable phenomenon. In that partnership, Gibil wasn't just a representation of fire, he became the guardian of the relationship between fire and humanity. One of the earliest ways people expressed this relationship was by keeping a perpetual fire burning. Many cultures did this, but in Mesopotamia it carried a special meaning. A perpetual flame was a symbol of continuity, responsibility and stability. It meant that the fire was never allowed to die. It was watched over, fed, and cared for. People assigned this duty to individuals who learned how to read fire's behaviour, how to keep it alive without letting it grow out of control. These caretakers didn't just manage a physical flame, they participated in a tradition that symbolised the constant presence of Gibil. As long as the sacred blaze burned, the god was present, protective, and active. That presence wasn't dramatic. It was calm, steady, and quietly essential. The idea of a sacred blaze also extended into homes. The hearth fire wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. It represented stability, family, and safety. The birthplace of meals, warmth, and conversation. People treated the hearth fire with a kind of respect that went beyond function. They fed it carefully, they didn't discard harmful materials into it, they soothed it when it crackled too loudly. They watched its colour to assess weather changes or omens. These small behaviours reflected a belief that fire deserved attention, that fire remembered care, that fire responded to respect. Gibil became the watcher of these behaviours. He wasn't simply the god of fire in a broad sense, he was the god who made sure fire remained a partner rather than a threat. People often imagine gods of fire as wild, dangerous, or unpredictable. But Gibil's nature was different. He was calm fire, controlled fire, useful fire, the fire that belonged in ovens, workshops, and homes. His guardianship didn't rely on dominance or intimidation. It relied on knowledge and balance. Fire that has purpose is fire that has boundaries. That idea shaped the way scribes described him. They said he purified. They said he refined. They said he revealed. Fire exposes flaws in metal. It tests materials. It shows what can withstand heat and what cannot. Gibil's presence in these processes made him a guardian not only of fire itself, but of quality, craftsmanship, and truth. A poorly made tool could hide its weakness from the eye, but not from flame. Fire told the truth, and Gibil ensured that truth was seen. In many early workshops, especially those dealing with metal, the furnace was treated almost like an altar. Workers approached it with respect. They monitored its temperature carefully. They knew how easily mistakes could ruin their materials or their tools. In these places, Gibil was more than a myth. He was a constant reminder that fire cooperated only with those who knew how to work with it. A novice might see flames licking at metal and assume the process was simple. But a master understood that fire required understanding. Too hot and the metal weakened. Too cool and it remained unmalleable. Balance was everything. Gibil guarded that balance. He made the process possible by embodying its principles. The role of guardian also showed up strongly in purification rituals. Fire has always been used to cleanse. It destroys harmful elements, drives away insects, sterilizes tools, and burns away what is unwanted. In ancient rituals, symbolic fires were used to purify objects before ceremonies. People believed that fire removed impurity not only physically but spiritually. This belief fed into Gibil's identity. He wasn't just the god of flames, he was the purifier, the one who ensured that what entered fire came out changed, the one who separated the useful from the useless, the pure from the impure. His guardianship was not simply about protecting fire, but about guiding the transformation that fire made possible. One of the most meaningful aspects of his guardianship was the idea that fire needed a protector, because it was vulnerable. Fire could be extinguished easily by wind, water, or neglect. It could also be stolen, misused, or allowed to go wild. Fire required protection because of its fragility and its strength. This duality made Gibil's role feel nuanced. He wasn't a conqueror of fire, he was its caretaker. He was the one who held the responsibility of ensuring that fire remained available, safe, and beneficial. In many myths, when fire escaped control or caused harm, it was described as acting outside of Gibil's guidance. That didn't make him weak. It made his role more important. Guardianship only matters when the thing being guarded can shift beyond safe boundaries. Ancient people also understood that fire could be stolen. This wasn't literal theft in most cases, but the ability of humans to take fire from one place and replicate it somewhere else. Fire was transferable, but not spontaneously generated. This meant that whoever controlled fire controlled a crucial resource. Gibil's guardianship helped define who had the right to use fire and how it should be handled. Priests invoked him during ceremonies where fire was carried from a sacred location to a new one. Warriors invoked him before burning fields to prepare for agriculture. Communities invoked him before lighting hearths for seasonal festivals. These practices reinforced the idea that fire wasn't simply an object. It had authority behind it. Gibil's guardianship gave structure to the use of fire, making its presence something regulated and respected. Another part of his role involved protecting the knowledge associated with fire. Fire alone isn't enough to create progress. People need to know how to control it, how to shape its heat, and how to understand its patterns. This knowledge was precious. It was passed down carefully from one generation to the next. Metalworkers guarded their methods. Potters taught their apprentices slowly. Ritual firekeepers learned when to tend flames and when to leave them alone. Gibil came to symbolize this transfer of knowledge. He wasn't only the guardian of the fire itself, but the guardian of the wisdom that allowed fire to transform the world. His role wasn't loud or flashy. It lived in the slow, steady passing of techniques, traditions, and principles. Even the imagery used to describe him emphasized his role as a caretaker. He wasn't drawn as a towering god or a fierce warrior. He was depicted as a figure surrounded by steady flames, not chaotic ones. His fire glowed rather than raged. It warmed rather than consumed. This steady glow made him feel approachable. People weren't afraid to call on him. Instead, they saw him as a supportive presence, someone who ensured that their fires burned cleanly, someone who helped them avoid mistakes, someone who offered protection without overshadowing their own skill. Gibil became a symbol of collaboration between humans and a powerful natural force. As civilizations advanced, Gibil's guardianship took on a new dimension. Fire was no longer a rare or surprising occurrence. It became central to daily life. Ovens ran constantly. Workshops produced goods that relied on fire. Cities glowed with lamps and torches. Fire became a constant companion. And with that constancy came a new type of responsibility. The more common fire became, the more easily people could take it for granted. Gibil's presence reminded them that fire was still something that could shift, flare, and resist control. His guardianship kept fire from fading into the background. It ensured that people remembered the respect and attention that fire deserved. One area where this was especially important was craftsmanship. In Mesopotamia, craftsmen held special status, particularly metal workers and potters. Their work required precision, patience, and knowledge passed down through tightly held traditions. Fire was at the center of everything they did. They understood its nuances better than anyone. They knew how it responded to different materials and environmental conditions. They knew how to coax it into doing delicate work. They knew when fire needed more fuel and when it needed more air. Their relationship with fire was almost personal. Gibil's role as a guardian reflected this relationship. He was the overseer of skilled work, the presence who ensured that the creative spark remained strong, stable, and available for those who needed it most. Gibil's guardianship also extended into the symbolic world. Fire was often associated with clarity, insight, and revelation. People believed that fire unveiled hidden truths by illuminating what was once dark. This made Gibil a guardian of understanding. not in the abstract philosophical sense, but in the practical sense. Fire revealed impurities in metal, cracks in pottery, and structural weaknesses in materials. It showed flaws that would otherwise remain hidden. People came to rely on fire as a kind of assistant in the process of evaluating quality. Gibil's role became intertwined with this insight. He didn't grant visions or prophecies, he granted clarity through the behaviours of flame. There were also beliefs that fire warded off harmful forces. It kept away animals at night. It discouraged insects. It protected homes from wandering spirits in some traditions. Gibil's guardianship naturally extended to this protective aspect. Fire wasn't only a tool for creation, it was a barrier, a boundary, a line of defence. People believed that as long as the sacred blaze burned, they were under Gibil's protection. This made the maintenance of fire not just a practical action, but a spiritual one. Keeping the flame alive kept the world stable. Letting it die created vulnerability. Gibil stood between these outcomes, ensuring that communities remembered the importance of the flame. The more people understood fire, the deeper their appreciation became. They learned how to bank embers to keep them alive overnight. They learned how to carry fire without extinguishing it. They learned how to construct homes and workshops to maximize airflow. And as their skills increased, their understanding of Gibil evolved. He was no longer seen simply as the being who guarded fire. He was the guardian of creativity itself, the one who ensured that humans had the ability to transform their environment. When people made tools, built structures, crafted ornaments, or shaped clay into pottery, they were participating in the creative spark that Gibil protected. His guardianship was no longer limited to physical fire. It expanded into the act of making, shaping, and building. This expansion made his influence subtle but ever-present. Gibil didn't need dramatic mythological appearances to assert his importance. His presence lived in every workshop, every home, every community that used fire. He lived in the hands of craftsmen, the care of firekeepers, and the traditions passed down through generations. His guardianship was part of the fabric of daily life, a quiet constant in a world full of change. The idea of guarding the creative spark also shaped how people viewed responsibility. Fire could be shared, knowledge could be shared, creativity could be shared, but each required trust, each required guidance. Gibil's role reinforced these values. He reminded people that creativity wasn't something to be taken lightly. It required effort, awareness, and respect. Fire might ignite quickly, but mastery took time. Gibil stood at the centre of that balance. His guardianship continued to evolve even as new gods rose to prominence and new stories gained popularity. Gibil's influence didn't fade, it simply shifted. People continued to rely on fire. They continued to need the creative spark. They continued to understand that fire demanded attention. And as long as fire held these roles, Gibil remained part of the world in which people lived. The sacred blaze that he guarded wasn't just a fire burning in a temple or a workshop. It was the idea that the world could be shaped, that creation was always possible, that transformation could happen at any moment. Gibil didn't protect fire for its own sake. He protected the possibility that fire represented. That possibility didn't end with the flame itself. It extended into every act of making, every spark of invention, every moment when people saw potential in raw materials. Gibil was the guardian of all these moments. He stood beside the creative spark, ensuring that it remained steady, accessible, and guided by those who understood its power. As people continued to build, discover, and create, his guardianship naturally led into the next part of his story, where the flame became more than a force and more than a tool. It became the beating heart of civilization, the partner of human progress, and the source of the knowledge that would shape entire worlds. Fire may seem ordinary to us now, something tucked into stovetops and lamps, hidden inside engines or flickering politely behind glass. But there was a time when fire wasn't familiar or predictable. It was astonishing. It was powerful. It was dangerous, and it was the beginning of everything that made civilization possible. For the ancient Mesopotamians, this transformation, the shift from fear to mastery, from reaction to intention, wasn't just a technological leap. It was a divine one. They attributed this change to Gibil, the god who didn't simply guard fire, but handed its gifts to humanity piece by piece. Gifts that shaped the earlier settlements, the first cities, and ultimately the foundations of the world as we know it. When people speak about civilization rising from the earth, they often mention agriculture, writing, or organized government. But there is something behind all of those. A tool that warms food, hardens clay, shapes metal, illuminates darkness, and strengthens foundations. Fire is the quiet engine powering every early step forward. Without it, civilization would have developed differently, if at all. And for those who lived in the river valleys where the first cities rose, fire was not just a discovery. It was a companion with a will, a presence with intelligence, a power that had to be understood and respected. In their stories, Gibil wasn't merely a being who controlled this power. He was the one who shared it, the first and perhaps greatest gift that fire brought, and that Gibil symbolically granted was the ability to claim permanence. Early humans lived in shelters that offered only temporary comfort. Wind, rain, predators, and cold nights all threatened stability. But fire changed the calculation. With fire, a shelter became a home. People gathered around warmth and light, and that gathering created community. It meant safety. It meant shared responsibilities. It meant the first steady rhythms that made life predictable. The glow of a hearth wasn't just a convenience. It was a declaration that humans intended to stay in one place long enough to build something. As villages began forming in ancient Mesopotamia, the hearth became the center of everything. Cooking, meeting, resting, discussing, teaching, it all happened around fire. People shaped their homes around it, and eventually shaped their towns around shared fire pits or communal ovens. A controlled flame meant a controlled life, and that stability allowed settlements to grow larger and more complex. When ancient storytellers said Gibil helped humans build their first communities, they didn't mean he stacked bricks or drew plans. They meant that without fire, there was no foundation for anything larger than small, fleeting groups. Fire was the first architecture. As settlements grew, so did the need for new materials. Simple huts needed reinforcement. Tools needed to become more durable. Food needed to be stored and preserved. And this is where the second of Gibil's gifts emerged, the power to shape the earth itself. Clay, abundant along the riverbanks, became the earliest building material for homes, vessels, and storage jars. But unfired clay had limits. It crumbled. It broke with a single drop. It softened with water. Fire changed that. When clay touched flame, it transformed into something harder than any natural substance available to early humanity. Pottery appeared not as an aesthetic luxury, but as a necessary step toward organized living. People watched clay harden in fire and realized they could store grain for months. They could carry water without fear that the container would dissolve. They could cook meals more efficiently. They could save, plan, and prepare. This changed not just lifestyles, but mindsets. Suddenly people weren't merely reacting to nature. They were shaping their environment. They could think long-term. They could manage resources. They could sustain larger communities. Gibil became the symbol of this power to transform nature into something durable and useful. Every pot, every jar, every brick carried a small mark of his gift. Bricks marked another monumental turning point. While stone was rare in many Mesopotamian regions, clay was everywhere. Early builders used mud brick, baking bricks in the sun to create walls for houses and small structures, but these bricks remained vulnerable to rain, to erosion, to the slow wearing down of time. Fire changed that as well. Kiln-fired bricks hardened by flame became the backbone of early architecture. With them, people could build walls that lasted, temples that endured, and city structures that reached heights never seen before. Cities like Uruk, Ur and Eridu weren't just collections of dwellings. They were expressions of mastery over the materials of the earth. Fire turned simple clay into the primary ingredient of civilization. It allowed architects and builders to create layers, chambers, plazas, and sanctuaries. It enabled expansion upward and outward. Without the hardening force of flame, life might have remained scattered and impermanent. With fire, humanity built spaces that lasted generations. This permanence formed the basis for culture, tradition, and governance. And with each fired brick, the people were reminded of the God who gave them the ability to forge a solid world from soft earth. The third gift fire brought was the birth of craftsmanship. Not in the decorative sense at first, but in the practical necessity of shaping tools. Stone tools had served early humans for thousands of years, but they came with obvious limits. They dulled quickly, they broke easily, they lacked precision. Fire introduced a new material, metal, into human hands. It began with naturally occurring metals like copper, which could be hammered into shapes. But once people realized that metals became malleable with heat, an entirely new era began. Early metalworkers learned how to place metal near flames, watching as it softened. They discovered how to heat ore until it separated from impurities. They learned how to combine metals to create stronger alloys. The process was slow, experimental, and often mysterious. It felt like uncovering secrets hidden inside the earth. No wonder people believed a divine being guided them. Gibil's connection to furnaces and kilns made him the patron of these experiments. He was the presence behind every tool that emerged from the workshop. Metal allowed for sharper blades, stronger axes, more durable farming equipment, and eventually weapons that shaped power structures. But beyond practicality, the ability to work with metal changed human identity. For the first time, people could intentionally create objects that outperformed anything found in nature. Fire wasn't only a force, it was an active partner in shaping the future. The flames that softened metal were considered the domain of Gibil, and the workers who tended those flames often invoked him for steady heat and safe results. Their livelihoods depended on fire that behaved predictably. In turn, they treated their furnaces with respect, as if the god himself resided inside. Another gift attributed to fire, and therefore to Gibil, was clarity. Not symbolic clarity, but literal visibility. Before artificial light, the world belonged to darkness as soon as the sun set. Dangerous creatures roamed freely. People couldn't work, travel, or gather safely. But fire changed the night. Lamps, torches, and hearths illuminated places that had always been swallowed by darkness. Night became more navigable, less threatening, more alive with activity. This glow extended civilization's hours. It allowed people to work in the early mornings or late evenings. It allowed travellers to move safely between settlements. It allowed rituals and storytelling to take place after sunset. Entire rhythms of life evolved because of this simple but profound extension of light. And since the flames symbolized Gibil's presence, people saw nighttime fires not just as practical tools, but as evidence that they were watched over, protected, and guided. The next gift fire gave humanity was control over food in ways that fundamentally changed biology, culture, and social structure. Cooking wasn't merely a convenience. It increased the nutritional value of food, made carbohydrates more digestible, softened fibrous plants, and reduced harmful bacteria. A cooked diet changed human evolution, allowing smaller digestive systems and larger brains. It supported larger groups and reduced time spent chewing, gathering, and recovering from illness. Fire turned raw ingredients into meals that strengthened bodies and communities. Every time food met flame, people believed they were participating in something guided by Gibil. The hearth wasn't just a place for warmth, it was a kitchen, a gathering space, a teaching space. and a small stage where the creative spark met nourishment. The way families arranged their homes reflected this. The hearth was central, meals were communal. Recipes, however simple, were passed down. Cooking became culture, and fire was behind every step. There was another element closely tied to fire's gifts: protection. Fire deterred animals at night. It guarded the entrances of villages. It cleared land for agriculture by burning shrubs and preparing soil. It served as a boundary that predators instinctively avoided. For early humans, fire was the line between vulnerability and safety. They associated this security directly with Gibil, the god whose flames watched over them. In some traditions, fire was used to protect infants, bless crops, and purify tools. It served as a cleanser, not only of objects but of spaces. Fire removed pests, destroyed waste, and sanitized environments long before people understood microbes. People saw these effects and believed Gibil was driving harmful forces away. His flame acted as a guardian of the physical environment. As settlements grew into towns and towns into cities, fire took on an even more significant role. It became the heart of industry. Kilns ran daily. Workshops relied on constant heat. Bakers, potters, metalworkers, and artisans depended on fire for their craft. In each of these spaces, Gibil's presence was not abstract. It was real, tangible, and essential. The success of a workshop depended on controlled heat, stable flames, and predictable temperatures. Workers developed methods for maintaining steady fires, adjusting airflow, and preventing accidents. Their knowledge formed the earliest science of combustion. They didn't describe it scientifically, but they lived it practically. These early industries fueled the growth of cities, trade, and cultural identity. Without fire, none of these industries could exist. Without Gibil, the flame had no guide. One of the most overlooked gifts fire provided, one that people often take for granted today, was communication. Signals created with fire allowed people to send messages across long distances. Beacon fires warned of danger, guided travellers, or marked the beginning of ceremonies. Torches lit processions, celebrations, and religious events. The glow of flames became a language. It conveyed urgency, safety, or unity. And because ritual fires were sacred, people believed these messages carried divine weight. Gibil's flame wasn't just a light, it was a communicator. Another important gift was innovation. Fire inspired creativity. Once people saw that flame could harden clay or melt metals, they began experimenting. They tried new materials. They tested new shapes. They developed glazes for pottery. They created bronze by combining copper and tin. They mixed different clays to see how each responded in kilns. In many ways, fire was the first laboratory. Workshops acted as early scientific spaces, even if people didn't call them that. Everything they learned came from observing how materials changed under heat. Gibil was the overseer of these experiments. He was the quiet presence encouraging curiosity. His flame pushed people to explore. The final gift that fire provided, and one of the most transformative, was organization. Managing fire required structure. It required designated spaces, assigned roles, and rules. Certain individuals became firekeepers, responsible for ensuring communal flames stayed lit. Workshops formed guild-like groups of craftsmen who protected their methods. Priests established rituals for sacred fires. These organizational systems formed the earliest hints of bureaucracy. Fire necessitated order, and that order shaped the social frameworks that later became governments. When people credited Gibil with helping them build civilization, they weren't exaggerating. Fire built homes, fire built tools, fire built cities, fire built culture, fire built security, fire built innovation. Each gift contributed to the emergence of complex societies where people shared work, resources, and knowledge. The flame didn't just warm individuals, it warmed the entire trajectory of human progress. The ancients understood that fire was both fragile and powerful. They knew how easily it could vanish and how quickly it could grow out of control. They respected its limits, they celebrated its strengths, and they created stories to anchor those truths. Gibil's story wasn't about heroic battles or dramatic quests. It was about the steady, patient unfolding of human potential, sparked by a flame that represented clarity, transformation, and possibility. As people continued shaping their world, they began to realize that the flame's gifts were not only physical but intellectual. Fire taught humans how to observe, how to experiment, how to create, how to refine, how to build. And all these lessons naturally led to the next stage in Gibil's story, where the creative spark expanded beyond practical uses and entered the realm of art, craftsmanship, and cultural identity. Fire didn't just build civilizations, it built the human imagination, and Gibil remained at its centre, guiding hands, illuminating discoveries, and shaping the direction of history one steady flame at a time. Long before writing appeared on clay tablets, long before kings carved their names onto monuments, long before cities rose from riverbanks, people discovered that fire could do more than warm hands and cook food. It could reveal things, it could teach, it could transform the world in ways nothing else could. And as ancient Mesopotamians watched these transformations, they began to understand fire not just as a force, but as a teacher. In their stories, this teacher had a name. Gibil was not simply the presence within the flame, but the guide who helped humanity uncover knowledge hidden inside the earth, inside materials and inside themselves. By the time early craftsmen began shaping the first simple tools, fire had already proven itself to be something extraordinary. It behaved in ways that were consistent yet surprising, dangerous yet manageable, familiar yet full of secrets. People noticed that certain stones cracked when heated while others softened. They noticed that metal nuggets found near riverbeds changed texture when exposed to flame. They noticed that clay responded to heat in ways that seemed almost magical. Each observation planted questions in their minds, and those questions led to experiments. And experiments, although they may not have been called that at the time, were the beginning of knowledge. The moment fire became a tool for discovery was the moment Gibil's role expanded. He was no longer just the guardian of flame. He became the patron of those who sought understanding through heat. He became the quiet companion of every person who lit a small fire to test a new idea, every worker who watched how something reacted to steady warmth, every curious mind who tried to understand why flames behaved the way they did. Gibil was the guide of trial and error, the presence who watched over those who dared to make mistakes. At first, the knowledge that came from fire was simple. People burned wood of different types and noticed that some woods burned hotter, some longer, some cleaner. That kind of understanding might seem small, but it represented a shift. People were no longer using fire passively. They were studying it. Fire became something to learn from, not just something to survive with. Gibil's flame was no longer just warmth, it was instruction. As people paid more attention, the discoveries deepened. Clay hardening into pottery was no small achievement. It required careful timing, consistent heat, and awareness of the materials. Too much heat could destroy the piece, too little would leave it fragile. The process demanded a relationship between human intention and fire's response. Early potters developed techniques through patience and observation, and each improvement felt like a revelation. It was no wonder they believed a god guided their hands. In their minds, Gibil wasn't giving them instructions through words. He was offering knowledge through the language of reactions, cracks, colours, textures, and shapes. But pottery was only the beginning. The true dawn of knowledge came when people first noticed that some stones behaved differently in fire. They didn't just crack or soften, they transformed. These stones contained metal hidden inside them, and fire exposed that hidden core. At first, it must have seemed confusing. A rock placed near heat suddenly changed shape, or revealed shiny material inside. It wasn't intuitive, it wasn't predictable, and it certainly wasn't something early humans expected. They experimented again and again, and gradually realized that these strange stones held something valuable. This was the birth of metalwork. Not through sudden enlightenment, but through countless small discoveries. Those discoveries accumulated over generations until people understood patterns. Certain stones always yielded copper, others yielded lead, others tin. They learned that metal could be shaped more easily when heated, that it became stronger when hammered, that mixing certain metals produced new results altogether. This kind of knowledge didn't just appear, it required persistence, attention, and curiosity. And since early societies explained the world through divine involvement, they credited Gibil for revealing these secrets. Metalwork changed everything. A polished copper blade cut more cleanly than any stone tool. A metal spearhead lasted longer than bone. Metal tools improved harvesting, building, hunting, and crafting. But perhaps the most profound change was the shift in mindset. Fire wasn't just a force anymore, it was a collaborator. People could use it to reshape their surroundings. They could melt, mould, and reshape what once seemed unchangeable. That ability created a sense of empowerment, and with it, a deeper appreciation of the flame that made it possible. Metalwork also required cooperation. A single person could gather clay and shape pottery alone, but metal extraction demanded collective effort. Someone collected ore, someone built furnaces, someone tended the fire, someone hammered the heated metal. Knowledge became communal. It passed from elder to apprentice, from workshop to workshop, from generation to generation. These transmissions of knowledge formed the early foundation of identity. A metalworker wasn't just a person with a job. They were part of a lineage that had mastered the secrets of fire. And because their craft depended on flame, their rituals often included invoking Gibil for steady heat and good results. The furnaces used for metalwork were not just practical structures. They were symbols of mastery. People built them with careful attention to airflow, insulation, and temperature control. Some furnaces were small, designed for simple tasks. Others grew into large, permanent structures that operated daily. The workers believed that within the roar of these furnaces lived the guidance of Gibil, not literally as a figure standing inside the flames, but as a presence that ensured the fires remained strong and predictable. Fire could be unpredictable when left alone, but inside a well-crafted furnace, it behaved like a controlled force. That sense of control represented knowledge that fire could be shaped, just like the materials within it. Gibil's influence continued to grow as metalwork advanced. People discovered alloys. They learned that copper alone was useful, but that adding tin created bronze, a material much stronger and more versatile. This discovery marked a profound shift in human capability. Bronze tools allowed larger construction projects. They improved agricultural efficiency. They transformed warfare. They gave rise to trade networks that connected distant communities. The value of bronze extended far beyond the tools themselves. It created the first complex economies. And behind this economic and cultural expansion was fire, the constant partner enabling metal to be shaped. At every stage of this development, Gibil was there in the myths. He wasn't portrayed as a dramatic figure handing metal to humans from the sky. Instead, he guided them through curiosity and experimentation. His flame offered hints, clues, and outcomes. Every successful alloy, every perfected firing technique, every strong blade was seen as a sign of his favour. Craftsmen were not merely workers. They were practitioners of a divine conversation with fire. Pottery, too, became increasingly sophisticated. Early clay vessels were simple and functional. But as people observed how fire changed clay, they experimented with shapes, decorations, and thicknesses. Techniques evolved over centuries. Different clays were mixed. Surfaces were smoothed or textured. Glazes were developed. Designs became more complex, not because people suddenly desired beauty, but because they learned how fire responded to specific conditions. Art began as experiment, not decoration, and every lesson came from the same teacher. This gradual shift into artistry is one of the clearest examples of how fire became knowledge. The first artworks created with the help of fire weren't made for aesthetics alone. They were expressions of understanding. A pot decorated with patterns wasn't just decoration. It was the potter's way of testing how heat affected pigments. A metal ornament wasn't just jewellery. It was a demonstration of skill and control over flame. Art emerged not as a separate field, but as an extension of craftsmanship. Fire didn't only shape objects, it shaped imagination. As artistic expression grew, so did the ritual surrounding fire. Temples used fire in ceremonies. Offerings were burned not simply to destroy them, but to allow smoke and scent to rise upward, connecting the earthly and the divine. Spices, resins, and oils were burned to create aromas that filled sacred spaces. These scents were believed to carry prayers into the unseen world. Fire became the medium of communication between humanity and the gods. And because Gibil represented the flame itself, he became the intermediary, the presence who ensured the ritual fire burned cleanly and carried the offering where it needed to go. The connection between fire and knowledge extended beyond practical skills. As humans watched flame behave, they learned about cause and effect. They learned patience. They learned precision. A fire fed too quickly flared dangerously. A fire fed too slowly died. A pot removed too soon cracked. A metal piece cooled incorrectly became brittle. These lessons cultivated something deeper than technical skill. They cultivated discipline. People began to understand that mastery required understanding not only of materials, but of timing, awareness, and consistency. This awareness shaped the early development of measurement. In order to maintain consistent heat, craftsmen learned to observe shadows, wind direction, and sun position. They watched how flames change colour depending on temperature. They learned the rhythm of heating and cooling. Over time, these observations contributed to early forms of standardization. People began paying attention to proportions, durations, and sequences. Fire guided them towards structure, order, and method. This slow accumulation of knowledge built a foundation for organized learning. Skills were no longer spontaneous discoveries. They became disciplines. Apprenticeship systems developed. Elders instructed younger workers through practice and demonstration. Knowledge became something preserved, protected, and expanded. Gibil's presence was invoked in these transitions, not because he lectured or wrote laws, but because his flame made learning possible. As metal tools improved, architecture evolved even further. With stronger tools, people carved larger stones, cut straighter beams, and shaped more precise building materials. Fire didn't only transform clay and metal, it transformed the structures built with them. Temples rose higher, city walls grew stronger, irrigation systems improved, roads expanded. Fire's influence reached into every part of civilization. Gibil's mythological role reflected this expansion. His guidance wasn't confined to workshops or kitchens, it extended into the very shape of society. This period also saw the rise of specialized professions. Metalworkers, potters, jewelers, builders, and artisans formed distinct roles within early cities. Their knowledge set them apart. Their skills were respected and often protected. Fire demanded practice and precision. It rewarded those who worked with intention. And so the social structure mirrored these demands. A craftsman wasn't simply a labourer. They were a keeper of knowledge. They understood fire in ways others didn't. Their connection to Gibil was considered closer, more intimate. They carried the wisdom of flame in their hands. Art continued to evolve alongside these crafts. As people discovered how heat affected pigments, glazes, and materials, artistic expression became more deliberate. Symbols appeared on pottery. Decorations adorned metal objects. Colours became part of cultural identity. Fire made these expressions possible by revealing how materials reacted to heat. And as art took shape, communities began using it to tell stories, record memories, and express beliefs. Fire became a medium through which imagination was realised. One of the most fascinating developments was the creation of seals, small carved cylinders rolled onto clay to create impressions. Although the carving itself wasn't done with fire, the preservation of seals required baked clay. Fire ensured these records survived. These seals became the earliest forms of identification, ownership, and bureaucracy. They told stories of daily life, transactions, and relationships. Fire preserved information long enough to be read by future generations. The flame didn't just teach, it helped people remember. As fire revealed more possibilities, early thinkers began connecting the behaviour of flame with natural processes. They observed that fire required fuel the way animals required food. They saw that fire produced smoke the way living beings exhaled. They noticed that fire grew when fed and died when neglected. These parallels shaped early philosophical ideas. Fire seemed alive, but not alive in the usual sense. It acted purposefully without possessing intentions. This ambiguity fascinated people, and Gibil became the embodiment of that paradox. Ordered yet unpredictable, alive yet not living, a guiding force without human form. Knowledge gained through fire also extended into medicine and hygiene. Heat sterilized tools, warmth soothed pain, smoke deterred insects. Fire was used to treat wounds, store food safely, and cleanse environments. Although people didn't understand bacteria, they understood results. They recognized patterns and attributed beneficial outcomes to divine influence. Gibil's guidance became part of healing practices. Fire cleansed not only materials but spaces, making homes safer and workshops more functional. As centuries passed, knowledge expanded further. Techniques improved, materials changed, art flourished. And through all these developments, Gibil's presence remained steady. He represented not only the flame, but the human capacity to learn, adapt, and transform. His story was intertwined with every advancement that fire made possible. When people looked back on their progress, they saw a trail of sparks, each one marking a moment of discovery, each one representing a gift that shaped their world. The dawn of craft wasn't a sudden awakening. It was the slow building of understanding, shaped by countless interactions with fire. Metalwork didn't appear overnight. It evolved through careful observation. Art didn't emerge as a separate discipline. It grew naturally from the desire to experiment with materials. Everything that fire touched became a source of knowledge, and everything learned from fire carried echoes of Gibil. The relationship between humanity and fire continued to deepen, leading into the next part of Gibil's story, where the flame became not only a tool of transformation, but a presence woven into ritual, worship, and the divine rhythms that shaped cities and cultures across the ancient world. Fire had already shaped the way people lived, worked, built, crafted, and imagined their world. It changed how they ate, how they created tools, how they stored food, and how they protected themselves. But as fire became a familiar partner in daily life, it also became something more. It became part of ceremony, belief, rhythm, and shared identity. People began to see fire not only as a practical force, but as a bridge, something that linked the physical world to whatever existed beyond their senses. And if fire was a bridge, then Gibil was the presence who lived at the point where that bridge touched the human world. His flame was not only heat and light, it was participation, it was invitation, it was presence. The rituals surrounding fire grew naturally. They did not start as elaborate ceremonies or carefully scripted traditions. They began as simple acts shaped by observation. When people placed food near fire and watched the smoke rise, they wondered where the smoke went. When they burned aromatic plants and noticed how the scent filled the air, they wondered if someone or something received it. When they offered objects to fire and watched them transform into ash, they wondered if the act carried meaning. These small questions formed the earliest rituals, and with each new gesture, fire took on a role beyond utility. Gibil became central to this expanding symbolic world. He wasn't a distant figure who resided in inaccessible realms. He was the one who appeared when flames rose in hearths, torches, furnaces, and temple braziers. Presence mattered, and because fire appeared instantly wherever it was lit, people felt as though Gibil could be summoned with effort, intention, and respect. The act of lighting a flame was not just about creating heat or light. It was an invitation for the god of fire to join the moment, witness the gathering, and guide the outcome. One of the oldest fire-related rituals was simply tending the hearth. It might seem ordinary, but to ancient communities, the hearth was more than a household feature. It was the centre of life. Maintaining a consistent flame required attention, patience, and care. The earliest firekeepers performed a ritual every single day, even if they didn't call it that. They fed the flame in the morning to welcome the day. They calmed it in the evening to prepare for rest. They read the fire's behaviour to predict weather or mood. Over time, these behaviours developed into established customs. A household that treated its hearth fire with respect was considered balanced, stable, and protected. Gibil was invoked in these moments not with loud speeches but with quiet mindfulness, the way someone respects a trusted companion. In temples, fire took on an even more formal role. Priests developed rituals that relied on flame as a medium. They burned offerings to carry prayers upward. They used fire to sanctify tools, spaces, and symbolic objects. They lit lamps before ceremonies and extinguished them afterward. Fire marked beginnings and endings. It cleansed spaces before gatherings. It sealed agreements in both spiritual and civic contexts. Gibil became the unseen participant in these rituals, the one who made the smoke rise correctly, the flame behave steadily, the heat remain consistent. When a ritual fire burned cleanly, it signalled approval. When it sputtered or produced excessive smoke, priests examined their steps carefully to ensure nothing in the ritual had been overlooked. Many rituals involving fire were tied to purification. Fire removed what was harmful or unwanted. Tools used in ceremonies were heated before use, not because people understood sterilization, but because they observed that heat rendered objects clean. Gibil's presence was invoked to ensure that impurities were burned away, that the flame performed its cleansing role, without harming the object or the person involved. Purification through fire extended to spaces as well. Before certain rites, priests passed torches or burning incense through temple halls, believing the heat and smoke drove out harmful influences. The fire didn't simply prepare the space physically, it prepared the space spiritually. It created an environment where communication between humans and the divine felt possible. Seasonal rituals also involved fire. In early agricultural societies, fire played a role in preparing fields, clearing brush, and enriching soil. But beyond the practical uses, fire became symbolic in seasonal transitions. At times marking the end of a harvest or the arrival of a new planting season, communities lit large fires to represent renewal, continuity, or gratitude. The flames symbolized life returning after challenges, light returning after darkness, and warmth returning after cold. Gibil was often recognized in these communal fires as the one who made renewal possible. His flame represented the energy needed to sustain the cycles of life. There were also personal rituals involving fire. Before important events, marriages, births, agreements, or journeys, families lit small fires to ask for guidance, protection, or clarity. The flame served as a witness. It was believed that Gibil saw what was spoken aloud near his flame, and that the smoke carried intentions upward. Because fire responded visibly to airflow, fuel, and environment, people interpreted its behaviour as signals. A steady flame meant consistency, A flicker meant attention. A sudden flare meant approval or heightened focus. These interpretations weren't superstition. They were part of a long tradition of reading natural signs for meaning. Gibil was the interpreter, the presence behind the flame's responses. In some communities, maintaining a perpetual flame was a collective responsibility. These fires burned in central spaces, watched over by designated guardians. They represented continuity not only of the flame itself, but of the people. If the fire remained lit, the community remained safe. If it died out, it was seen as a sign of disruption. Gibil's role in these spaces was not to command or threaten, but to remind people of their shared responsibility. The flame symbolized the group's identity, unity, and stability. Its presence encouraged cooperation, order, and trust. There were also rituals that connected fire with the afterlife. In funerary practices, fire was not always used directly to cremate bodies, as that was not the primary tradition in Mesopotamia. But fire played a role in ceremonies surrounding death. Lamps were placed near burial sites. Flames were carried during processions. Incense was burned to honour the spirits of the deceased. Fire symbolised guidance, ensuring that the departed found their way. It also symbolised protection, keeping harmful forces at bay during vulnerable transitions. Gibil's presence in these rituals was gentle and respectful. He was the light in darkness, the companion during transitions, the stable flame that reassured the living. Fire also appeared in divination. Priests and specialised practitioners watched flames for signs. They observed how a fire caught onto fuel, how it crackled, how it leaned with the breeze. They interpreted patterns in the smoke. These signs were not considered random. They were seen as messages from the divine realm, with Gibil serving as the communicator. The flame's behaviour became a language understood only by those trained to read it. These readings guided decisions in everything from agriculture to warfare to diplomatic agreements. The role of fire in ritual offerings was perhaps the most enduring. Offerings of food, incense, oils, or crafted objects were placed into flames not because fire destroyed them, but because fire transformed them. A physical object became smoke, scent, or light. This transformation was symbolic of communication. Fire made it possible for something earthly to become something intangible. Gibil was the facilitator of this transition. His flame represented the passage between realms. People believed that whatever was offered through fire reached the gods more directly, carried by heat and smoke. The rituals surrounding fire weren't uniform. Different cities developed their own traditions. Temples dedicated to various gods used fire in unique ways. But Gibil's presence remained steady in all of them, because fire itself was steady in its essential nature. Whether used for purification, offering, divination, protection, celebration, or daily care, fire behaved in recognizable patterns. Those patterns created a foundation upon which rituals were built. Even outside formal ceremonies, fire influenced cultural practices. Storytelling often took place around fires at night, creating a shared sense of comfort and connection. Songs were sung within the glow of lamps. Children learned about their ancestors while watching sparks rise into the air. Firelight made faces visible, creating intimacy in gatherings. These moments weren't ritual in a strict sense, but they carried deeper meaning. Fire brought people together. It illuminated not just their surroundings, but their shared experiences. Gibil became part of these moments too, not as a solemn figure, but as the reason those moments were possible. As civilizations grew more complex, fire took on administrative roles within temples and palaces. Lamps marked sacred boundaries. Torches illuminated important hallways. Ceremonial fires marked the start of official proceedings. Fire accompanied oaths, treaties, and declarations. Gibil's presence in these contexts reinforced the idea that fire bore witness to truth. A declaration made in front of flame held weight. Breaking such a declaration was believed to invite consequences, because the flame had heard it and its god had taken note. Craftsmen also developed rituals connected to their work. Before lighting a furnace, metalworkers performed small gestures or murmured words acknowledging the flame they were about to call forth. They asked for steady heat, good results, and safety. They knew how easily a furnace could become unpredictable. Their respect for fire was rooted in experience, and their rituals reflected that understanding. Gibil was not invoked for dramatic intervention, but for steadiness, clarity, and cooperation. The rituals of potters followed similar patterns. They prepared their kilns carefully, ensuring even heat and proper ventilation. Before placing their work inside, some offered small amounts of grain or incense to the flame, acknowledging the uncertainty of the firing process. A pot could emerge strong and beautiful, or it could crack unexpectedly. Fire decided the outcome. Gibil's presence was the assurance that the potter had done all they could. The rest was entrusted to the flame. In many ways, fire rituals taught people how to focus. Lighting a flame required attention. Tending it required consistency. Reading it required observation. The rituals reinforced these lessons, shaping habits that extended into other parts of life. Early communities learned cooperation, patience, and discipline through these repeated acts. These values influenced their social structure, decision-making, and cultural identity. Gibil's role in shaping these values wasn't through commands or written teachings. It was through the daily practice of interacting with flame. Fire also played a role in moments of crisis. During illness, storms, or conflict, people gathered around fires for comfort and stability. They believed that flames protected them from harm, whether physical, spiritual, or emotional. These gatherings were informal rituals driven by instinct. People sought the glow because it felt safe. They believed Gibil stood at the centre of that safety, not as a warrior or rescuer, but as a presence that stabilised the world around them. As rituals evolved, the imagery associated with Gibil shifted too. He was sometimes described as a figure emerging from flames, sometimes as the flame itself, sometimes as the heat within the fire. But he was never depicted as distant or aloof. His presence was immediate. Whenever a flame was lit, he was considered near. This nearness made fire rituals feel personal. People believed they were speaking directly to a god who listened, responded, and cared. By the time cities grew into influential centres of culture, fire rituals had become embedded into everyday life. They guided how people cooked, crafted, healed, worshipped, governed, and celebrated. They shaped identity and tradition. And through all of these practices, Gibil's presence remained steady. He was the constant flame, the balanced heat, the transforming force, the witness, the purifier, the guide. As fire rituals matured, they set the stage for a deeper relationship between humans and divine presence. The next part of Gibil's story moves into the realm where flame was not only a tool or a ritual instrument, but a messenger, something that carried meaning through symbols, omens, visions, and signs interpreted by those who dedicated their lives to reading the behaviour of light, heat, and smoke. By the time fire had become a part of daily life, shaping homes, tools, food, and ceremonies, the people of Mesopotamia had already learned to see the flame as something more than a useful presence. They believed it carried meaning. Not the kind of meaning spoken in human language, but the kind expressed through movement, brightness, smoke, and reaction. If the world had signs woven into it, fire seemed to display those signs more clearly than anything else. Its behaviour shifted instantly with the smallest change in fuel, wind, moisture, or intent. Priests learned to watch it closely, not out of superstition, but because they noticed patterns. And in a world without scientific explanation, patterns meant communication. Fire was already a bridge in rituals, a companion in daily routines, and a purifier in sacred spaces. But for priests it became a text. The flames themselves formed a script that could be read, if one understood its subtleties. This wasn't a matter of staring into fire and imagining images. It was a deliberate practice developed over generations of observation. Priests trained their eyes, strengthened their attentiveness, and studied how fire behaved under different conditions. They learned which signs indicated stability, which signs suggested disruption, and which signs warned of approaching changes in nature or society. They believed Gibil was behind these messages, not speaking in words, but revealing insights through the behaviour of his flame. The practice of reading fire began with smoke. Smoke was the first thing people noticed when lighting a flame. Sometimes it rose smoothly in a clean column, sometimes it drifted sideways, sometimes it thickened, sometimes it vanished quickly. Smoke responded to air, moisture, fuel type, and technique, but early observers didn't know the physics behind these reactions. What they saw was variability, and variability invited meaning. A priest watching smoke could tell if the fire was too damp, if the fuel was impure, or if something in the environment was shifting. They began to interpret these visible changes as messages. If the smoke rose straight into the sky, they believed the offering had been accepted. If it swirled or hesitated, they examined the conditions more carefully. If it drifted toward a particular direction, they considered what events or people lay in that direction. These interpretations weren't random. They were built on centuries of recorded observations. They noticed that when winds shifted before storms, smoke tended to lean in certain ways. They noted that certain fuels produced consistent smoke patterns, while others produced unpredictable ones. Over time, priests mapped these behaviours onto outcomes. The practice became a system, a way of interpreting the unseen world through visible signs. The light of the flame offered another field of study. Priests observed how flames change colour depending on the materials burned. A bright yellow flame meant one thing, a pale flame meant another. A sudden burst of brightness during a ceremony was taken seriously, especially if it occurred at a moment of significance. They noted when flames flickered sharply and when they moved with steady rhythm. A calm flame suggested order and harmony. A restless flame suggested change or imbalance. Again, these interpretations grew from practical experience. If a flame flickered wildly, it might have been reacting to a draft, but drafts themselves were signs of weather shifts. If a flame dimmed unexpectedly, it could indicate impurities or structural issues in the fuel. Priests linked these physical realities with spiritual meaning, creating a system where natural signs became part of divine communication. The presence of Gibil was central to this system. Because fire belonged to him, and because he was believed to guide its movement, the priests saw every shift as intentional, not in a human sense where someone delivers messages with clear intent, but in the sense that a divine presence imbued natural patterns with significance. Gibil didn't whisper. He didn't issue commands. He expressed himself through the movements of flame and the trails of smoke. Reading those movements was not about seeking hidden secrets. It was about paying attention to the world and recognizing the signals embedded in it. Priests often conducted fire readings at night, when darkness made the flame stand out more clearly. The contrast allowed them to see subtle shifts in brightness and direction. Nighttime also made smoke more visible, especially against starlight. These readings sometimes took place on rooftops, temple courtyards, or specially prepared outdoor altars. The environment mattered. A controlled setting allowed clearer interpretations. Scenes that combined fire and stars naturally drew attention, because the sky was considered another realm of signs. Priests often glanced between the flame and the night sky, noting how both behaved. If stars dimmed behind clouds, if winds shifted, if the moonlight changed the colour of the flames, these details shaped the reading. The connection between fire and stars grew stronger over time. Priests already practiced detailed astronomy, tracking the movements of constellations, planets, and seasonal cycles. They believed the heavens communicated the will of the gods. When fire readings and star readings overlapped, they felt the message was especially significant. If the smoke drifted toward a constellation associated with a particular deity, they interpreted it as collaboration or influence. If a flame behaved strangely at the same moment a star vanished behind clouds, they considered it confirmation. These combinations form the basis for many decisions affecting agriculture, temple activity, or community rituals. Despite the complexity of these practices, fire divination was not considered mysterious or inaccessible. It was a skill that priests learned with patience, much like reading patterns in water, clouds, or animal behaviour. Fire was simply one of many tools. What made it special was its responsiveness. Fire changed instantly with environment, making it a dynamic medium. Priests trusted it because it reflected circumstances truthfully. A flame that refused to catch could indicate moisture or impurities. A flame that burned too quickly could indicate dryness or imbalance. These physical signs translated into symbolic meaning. Gibil, as the god of fire, was believed to guide these signs, not in a literal manipulative sense, but in the sense that the flame was his domain. Fire readings often accompanied important decisions. Before planting seasons, priests lit ritual fires to observe smoke patterns. If the smoke drifted smoothly upward, they took it as a sign of favourable conditions. If it drifted low or dispersed too quickly, they predicted challenges in the coming season. During political negotiations, fires were lit to mark agreements. Priests observed the flames as oaths were spoken. A stable fire implied a reliable agreement. A struggling flame suggested that tensions remained unresolved. These interpretations influenced not only daily life, but the course of cities. There were also rituals in which individuals sought personal guidance. A family might bring small offerings to a priest, who would burn them in a controlled fire and interpret the resulting smoke and flame. The offering could be a handful of grain, a piece of cloth, or a simple crafted object. The priest's reading provided reassurance, direction, or warnings. These moments were intimate, shaped by trust. People believed that Gibil, through the flame, acknowledged their concerns. Priests also interpreted fire behaviour during temple ceremonies. If a flame unexpectedly brightened during a song or chant, they noted it. If incense smoke shifted direction during a prayer, they considered it part of the conversation between humans and the divine. These interpretations were recorded on clay tablets, providing a rich body of patterns that influenced future readings. Priests didn't rely solely on intuition. They relied on accumulated knowledge, carefully noted over centuries. Fire divination also connected to the preparation of ritual spaces. Before an important ceremony, priests lit small fires in different corners of a temple or courtyard to observe airflow. If flames behaved inconsistently, they adjusted the space, moving objects, opening passages or altering arrangements. This practical activity had a symbolic layer. A space where fire behaved predictably was considered aligned with divine harmony. A space where fire resisted cooperation required adjustment. One of the more complex practices involved burning incense mixtures, whose ingredients were carefully selected to produce specific types of smoke. Priests paid close attention to how the mixture burned. If smoke formed spirals, they noted it. If it spread evenly, they took it as a sign of balance. If it separated into thin lines, they interpreted the meaning based on context. Each ingredient in the mixture contributed to how the smoke behaved, and priests learned these behaviours through long experience. Their skill wasn't about imagination. It was about understanding how materials interacted with fire. Another form of interpretation came from watching how flames consumed offerings. A piece of fabric that burned quickly suggested one outcome. A piece that burned slowly suggested another. If an offering made of wood crackled loudly, they considered that too. The type of crackle mattered. Priests distinguished between sharp cracks and soft pops. Every detail provided information. Gibil's presence, as they understood it, guided these details. Fire was honest. It did not hide responses. It revealed reactions plainly. Interpreting those reactions was a way of reading the world. Observing flames also influenced temple architecture. Builders designed spaces with specific airflow patterns to allow ritual fires to burn cleanly. They added vents or openings in ceilings to control smoke. These architectural decisions weren't only practical, they were intended to create environments where fire could express itself clearly, making divination easier. Priests worked closely with builders to ensure that temples honoured the needs of flame. Gibil's presence shaped not only rituals, but the spaces where those rituals occurred. Fire readings also served as environmental indicators. Priests noticed how flames reacted to different levels of humidity, temperature, and atmospheric pressure long before such concepts were formally understood. Their observations helped predict storms, droughts, or winds. These predictions influenced agricultural planning and preparations for seasonal shifts. Through fire, communities gained early warning signs that protected crops and guided decisions. Gibil's flame became a tool of environmental awareness, connecting people to cycles they couldn't see directly. Some fire readings included a connection to dreams. If a priest experienced a vivid dream related to fire, smoke, or heat, they often performed a divination the following day to interpret its significance. The result wasn't considered random. The flame's behaviour either confirmed or contextualised the dream. Fire readings validated intuition, linking internal experience with external signs. This interplay between the inner world and the physical flame reinforced the belief that Gibil communicated through multiple channels. In certain festivals, large communal fires were lit, and priests stood around them to observe how different parts of the fire behaved. A large fire created varied conditions, hotter in some areas, cooler in others. Flames rose at different speeds, smoke drifted in multiple directions. This complexity made readings more nuanced. Priests interpreted these patterns as indicators of the community's well-being. Large fires revealed more information, much like multiple voices offering different perspectives. Despite the depth and importance of these practices, fire divination remained grounded. Priests never claimed that fire revealed exact details about future events. Instead, fire offered indications, tendencies, or conditions. It was a guide, not a guarantee. This made the interpretations practical, not fatalistic. Communities could prepare based on signs, not surrender to them. Gibil's flame illuminated possibilities rather than certainties. Through all of these practices, fire served as both a tool and a presence. People understood it through experience, but experienced it through belief. It was a physical object and a spiritual communicator. And because fire was never still, always moving, always shifting, it felt alive in a way that invited attention. Gibil embodied that aliveness, not as a dramatic force, but as a guiding presence who shaped how people interacted with the world. As fire readings became more refined, they influenced more than rituals and decisions. They shaped how communities saw themselves in relation to nature, the gods, and each other. Fire didn't simply teach people how to observe flames. It taught them how to observe life. Every flicker became a reflection of the larger world. Every shift in smoke carried suggestions of what to watch for. Priests learned to read the world through the flame, and the flame became a mirror that reflected not only divine influence, but human awareness. The next part of Gibil's story emerges naturally from this. As fire connected ritual spaces, workshops, homes, and courtyards, entire cities formed identities around the glow of his presence. The structures built, the tools crafted, and the rituals practiced all carried his influence. And in those places, temples, workshops, and households, fire didn't just communicate, it lived, becoming part of the architecture, the rhythm, and the memory of the cities that called his name. By the time fire had woven itself into rituals, craft, and divination, the ancient world had already begun to change in ways that would define the course of human history. Small settlements expanded into towns. Towns became cities, and cities grew into places where thousands of people lived, worked, created, worried, celebrated, and dreamed within the same clusters of streets and courtyards. As these places formed, fire remained at the heart of everything. It lit doorways, warmed ovens, shaped tools, and guided ceremonies. Wherever people built new structures, they made space for flame, and wherever flame appeared, Gibil's presence was never far away. Cities in Mesopotamia were built from the materials people had at hand: clay, reeds, bitumen, and eventually bricks hardened by fire. Their rooftops were flat, their streets were narrow, their temples rose above the surrounding homes, and between all of these spaces fire glowed. Not in dramatic infernos or theatrical displays, but in humble lamps, busy workshops, steady kilns, and quiet hearths that lit the thresholds of family dwellings. The glow of a city at night wasn't bright, but it was constant. It was a reminder of how deeply fire shaped urban life. Gibil's presence wasn't confined to temples. He wasn't a god who lived only within ceremonial walls. His flame followed people everywhere, into kitchens, marketplaces, guard posts, bakeries, forges, and communal areas. Each place had its own kind of fire, and each fire carried its own meaning. The combination of all these flames made the city feel alive, as if it breathed through the glow of countless small fires flickering in different rhythms. One of the most striking places where Gibil's presence was felt was the temple. Temples in Mesopotamia were not simply religious centres. They were administrative hubs, economic centres, storage facilities and schools. They housed priests, scribes, and workers who maintained the sacred spaces. Fire played several roles in these temples. It illuminated hallways during evening rituals. It purified offerings. It burned incense that filled rooms with scent. It heated small metal tools used during ceremonies, and in some temples, a perpetual flame burned in a dedicated space, tended by appointed firekeepers whose task was to ensure that it never went out. This perpetual flame wasn't simply symbolic. It represented the ongoing relationship between the divine and the human world. A flame that burned continuously required constant attention, and that attention reflected devotion, discipline, and stability. Gibil's presence in these flames was not dramatic. It was steady. People didn't imagine him arriving in bursts of fire. They believed he lived within the consistent glow that never faltered. The flame was a sign of continuity, and continuity was sacred. Temples often included workshops associated with ritual objects. Metalworkers created small figurines, tools, and ceremonial instruments. Potters crafted vessels for offerings. Woodworkers constructed altars and furniture. Every craft required fire, and each time a craftsman heated a tool or a piece of metal, they invoked the presence of Gibil, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a small gesture. These workshops weren't separate from the temple's spiritual purpose. They were part of the environment where divine presence and human skill intertwined. The boundaries between sacred and practical were thin. Fire connected everything. In the bustling neighbourhoods of ancient cities, workshops became landmarks. A metalworker's forge produced sounds that echoed down alleyways. The hammering of bronze, the hiss of hot metal meeting cool water, the steady hum of a furnace. These were familiar daily sounds. People walking to the marketplace could hear the rhythm of metal being shaped. They could smell the mixture of burning charcoal and heated ore. They could see the red glow that filled the interiors of forges. For these workers, Gibil was not a distant figure. He was the unseen teacher whose flame made their craft possible. They treated their furnaces with the same respect priests offered in temples. Workshops varied widely. Some focused on simple tools like knives, axes, or farming equipment. Others produced decorative items, jewellery, ornaments, or ceremonial pieces. Some roasted clay tablets to harden written documents. Others crafted pottery used in everyday life. Fire was present in every one of these spaces. Even if the workshops were modest, their flames represented a kind of sacred activity, one that shaped the material world through knowledge passed down across generations. Larger cities often had entire districts dedicated to crafts that required flame. Metalworking districts clustered around places where fuel was easier to transport. Pottery district gathered near clay sources. Dye-making shops used heated vats to fix colours into fabrics. bakers operated large ovens that ran almost constantly to feed growing populations. Each of these spaces required firekeepers who understood the specific needs of their craft. To an outsider, fire in these districts might have appeared purely practical, but to those who worked within them, flames carried a sense of purpose. Their behaviour mattered, their personality mattered, and their reliability reflected the guidance of Gibil. In many ways, the flame became a collaborator in the life of a city. It reacted to weather, materials, and techniques. It behaved differently for experienced craftsmen than for novices. It revealed flaws in materials and rewarded skill. It tested workers with challenges and offered clarity when they understood its patterns. This relationship wasn't romanticized. It was built through daily experience. Fire shaped the workflow of the city as surely as water shaped its agriculture. Another place where fire played an integral role was the household. Homes in cities were compact, with small courtyards open to the sky. In these courtyards, families kept their hearths. The hearth wasn't merely for cooking, it was a place of gathering, warmth, and memory. Children grew up watching their parents tend the flame. They learned when to add fuel, how to coax a spark into flame, and how to protect fire from wind. The hearth taught them responsibility. And because fire was associated with Gibil, tending the hearth carried spiritual significance even in the most ordinary moments. Families believed that a well-tended hearth protected them. Its glow warded off darkness and unwelcome forces. Its warmth created comfort during cold nights. Its smoke signalled life to the community. In some households, small offerings were placed near the hearth before important events. A pinch of grain, a piece of bread, or a few drops of oil. These gestures weren't elaborate ceremonies. They were expressions of gratitude. They acknowledged the flame as a partner in daily survival. And through these gestures, Gibil remained part of a home life, not as a distant deity but as a quiet companion. Public spaces in cities also used fire for purposes that blended function and symbolism. Torches illuminated city gates at night. Lamps burned along walls or in public buildings. Market stalls often had small fires to warm food or illuminate transactions. Fire acted as a marker of safety in dark streets. Guards patrolling city perimeters carried torches as signs of vigilance. Travellers arriving at night could see the glow of a city from a distance and know they were approaching a place of security. The glow belonged to thousands of small fires, each shaped by different needs, but all part of the same network of light. In cities near rivers, fire played another role. Boats used lamps for navigation. Fishermen used small fires for drying nets or preparing meals. Dock workers used torches to guide goods unloaded during evening hours. The riverfront at night reflected flickering lights from countless sources, creating a shimmering effect that blended with starlight. This mixture of firelight and water shaped the atmosphere of many ancient cities. People associated these glowing reflections with Gibil's presence, not because he controlled water, but because fire's light transformed everything it touched. Sacred forges were among the most unique spaces in any city. These forges were not only places where craftsmen created tools for temples or ceremonies, they were places where certain rituals took place, rituals involving fire that required the presence of both priest and craftsman. When a temple commissioned a ceremonial object, especially those made of metal, the process was treated with reverence. The craftsman prepared the forge carefully. Priests often blessed the tools or materials before ignition. The first sparks were watched closely. Every step carried meaning. Sacred forges combined artistry, devotion, and technical skill. The craftsmen who worked there understood the gravity of their role. They weren't simply creating objects. They were participating in a process that linked the material and spiritual worlds. The flame in such forges was treated with extraordinary respect. It wasn't allowed to burn wastefully or unpredictably. It was fed carefully, maintained steadily, and extinguished properly. The workers believed that Gibil observed these practices. A well-crafted object was seen as the result of harmony between fire, craftsman, and divine presence. Even outside sacred contexts, workshops played a vital role in shaping a city's prosperity. A thriving forge district meant strong tools, advanced trade, and economic stability. A reliable pottery district meant durable containers, efficient storage, and improved food security. These areas were indicators of a city's health. Their flames signalled productivity. They represented the knowledge accumulated over generations, all guided by the behaviour of fire. Temples also stored the written records of city life. Clay tablets detailing trade, laws, rituals and taxes were dried or fired in kilns to ensure their preservation. Fire protected information. It turned soft clay into something that could survive for centuries. Without fire, many of the records that form our understanding of ancient civilizations would never have survived. The process of firing tablets was practical, but it carried symbolic meaning too. Fire transformed fleeting words into enduring marks. Priests and scribes understood this transformation deeply. They attributed its reliability to the steadiness of Gibil's flame. Sometimes fire shaped the identity of entire cities. Certain places became known for their forges, others for their pottery, others for their brickwork. Families built legacies around these crafts. Children inherited skills from parents. Workshops passed down knowledge through generations. The reputation of a city depended in part on the quality of goods produced in its flame-filled spaces. This identity created pride, tradition, and community memory. Fire was the centre of it all. Its glow marked the rhythm of daily life. In many cities, festivals involving fire were major events. People gathered in open squares or near temple courtyards to light large communal flames. These gatherings served multiple purposes: celebration, gratitude, renewal, and connection. As people watched the flames rise, they felt part of something larger than themselves. Fire had a way of drawing people together, of making them aware of shared hopes and worries. Gibil's presence in these fires wasn't imagined as spectacle. It was felt in the warmth, the light, the shared stillness of the moment. And while cities changed over time, expanding walls, new rulers, shifting priorities, the role of fire remained stable. It continued to shape architecture, industry, ritual, and home life. It remained central to daily routines. It lit the same streets generation after generation. Its glow reflected on the same walls. It consumed the same fuels. Gibil's presence became woven into the identity of every city that depended on flame. These glowing cities were not merely places where people lived. They were places where fire formed the backbone of community. Temples glowed with ceremonial flames. Workshops pulsed with the heat of forges. Hearths warmed families. Market stalls flickered with cooking fires. Lamps guided travellers. Sacred fires carried prayers. Every flame added to the whole. Together they made the city feel alive, safe, productive, and connected. Through all of this, Gibil's role was not loud or dramatic. He didn't dominate mythology with grand battles or cosmic feats. His presence was quieter, woven into the fabric of everyday life. He lived in the glow of lamps, the heat of furnaces, the breath of kilns, and the steady flames that illuminated the earliest urban nights. And as cities grew, the flame transformed from a practical necessity into a symbol of resilience and renewal. The next part of Gibil's story follows this transformation closely, exploring how fire became not only the heart of creation, but also the force that reshaped the world in moments of renewal, destruction, and rebuilding. Fire had always been a partner to early humanity. It warmed homes, shaped metal, hardened clay, purified spaces, and illuminated nightfall. It guided priests in rituals, revealed omens through smoke and light, and gave craftsmen the power to transform raw earth into useful forms. But the ancients understood something deeper, something less comforting and more difficult to acknowledge. Fire could also consume everything it touched. It could erase fields, topple homes, melt tools, and undo years of labour in a single night. People living in the first cities didn't need stories to understand this part of fire's nature. They saw it, they feared it, and yet they also learned something unexpected from these moments of destruction. In Mesopotamia, fire was both creator and destroyer, giver and taker, protector and threat. The same flame that made civilizations possible could also force them to rebuild. And in the mythic world of gods and symbols, this duality shaped the way people understood Gibil. He wasn't only the god who guided the steady glow of workshop fires, or the calm flame of temple lamps. He was also the one who presided over firestorms, over outbreaks of heat that spread through the world with terrifying speed. But rather than seeing this destructive aspect as malicious, they saw it as part of a cycle, one that, in its own difficult way, carried purpose. People living in the early cities knew that fire could sweep through dense neighbourhoods quickly. Homes were built of dried brick and wooden beams. Roofs were reinforced with reed mats. Markets were packed with stalls made of highly flammable materials. Forges burned constantly. Ovens ran day and night. Lamps flickered in every corner. Even a small spark carried by wind or knocked over by accident could ignite an entire block. Families lived close together. Workshops operated side by side. A single accident could become a disaster. But after every fire, something happened that might seem surprising to someone looking back from the modern world. People rebuilt, not slowly or reluctantly, but with determination. They cleared debris, salvaged what they could, and began constructing again. In those moments, fire's destructive power was understood as part of a process that revealed weaknesses, flaws, and opportunities for improvement. Destruction laid bare what needed attention, what was too fragile, what had been ignored. Firestorms forced communities to renew themselves. Gibil wasn't viewed as the cause of fires in the sense of punishing or seeking destruction. Instead, he was seen as the presence who helped people understand and endure what followed. His flame purified and transformed. Even in destruction, his influence carried meaning. When a fire swept through a neighbourhood and left behind blackened walls and fragments of pottery, the people who lived there did not feel abandoned. They saw in the aftermath a landscape ready to be rebuilt. Rebuilding was not merely physical labour. It was a communal act that brought people together. Workers from all professions contributed: potters, carpenters, brickmakers, metal workers, farmers. Each person brought something needed, and each person worked knowing that fire had revealed something essential. The city could only thrive if it continued to adapt. Firestorms were moments of transformation, painful but ultimately clarifying. Gibil's presence in these events wasn't found in the destruction itself, but in the possibility of renewal. Communities often held small gatherings after a major fire, lighting new hearths or torches to mark the beginning of reconstruction. It wasn't a celebration of what had been lost. It was a gesture of commitment. Lighting a new fire was a way of saying, "We continue." People understood that the flame was not the enemy. It was the same force that had sustained them for generations. They believed that Gibil's role was to guide them through the cycle: creation, destruction, and creation again. Even in everyday life, fire's destructive tendencies taught valuable lessons. Farmers used controlled burns to clear fields, knowing that fire stripped away unwanted growth and strengthened the soil. Metal workers understood that fire had to break down impurities before a metal could be shaped into something useful. Brickmakers knew that raw clay had to endure intense heat before becoming strong enough to support a building. In every craft, fire's destructive side was the beginning of its constructive power. The flame that consumed also refined, reduced, and purified. Priests too saw this duality in their rituals. They burned offerings not to destroy them, but to transform them. The moment the offering disappeared into flame was the moment it became something else. Smoke rising toward the divine. Fire didn't merely erase, it changed, it carried, it revealed. The loss of something physical became the presence of something symbolic. This way of thinking shaped how people understood firestorms in their cities. Destruction wasn't seen as an ending. It was a forced transition, a moment where old structures gave way to new ideas. When neighbourhoods rebuilt, they often improved the layout, strengthened walls, or altered designs based on what the fire had exposed. The rebuilding process became a form of progress. The same logic applied to temples and workshops. A forge destroyed in a fire was rebuilt with better airflow. A kiln lost in an accident became an opportunity to redesign the firing process. A damaged home became a chance to reinforce the structure or reorganise household spaces. The flame shaped cities twice, once through creation and once through renewal. People saw patterns in how fire behaved. They noticed that fire followed pathways, exploited weaknesses, and avoided places with specific materials or structures. Over generations, these patterns influenced architectural choices. Builders designed walls to slow the spread of flames. They placed forges in specific areas to minimise risk. They separated storage spaces from living quarters. These decisions came from experience, but the experience itself was understood through the presence of fire's lessons. Gibil wasn't seen as testing people, but as offering guidance through the visible outcomes of fire's behaviour. Even myths reflected this understanding. Stories about Gibil often portrayed him as a figure who stood at the boundary between creation and destruction. He wasn't described as unpredictable. He was constant. Fire behaved according to its nature. It consumed what was vulnerable. It strengthened what could withstand heat. In this way, Gibil became a symbol of truth. Fire revealed the structural integrity of a building, the purity of metal, the quality of clay, the discipline of the craftsman, and the preparedness of a community. When destruction occurred, it wasn't viewed as senseless. It was a harsh but honest reflection of what needed attention. Renewal wasn't only physical. Firestorms often led to shifts in leadership, changes in resource allocation, and new approaches to community organisation. When part of a city burned, people had to rethink where to place workshops, how to store grain, or how to cluster homes. These decisions shaped the evolution of urban life. Fire, through destruction, became a catalyst for innovation. Gibil's presence was felt in these moments not as a force causing suffering, but as a presence illuminating the wiser path forward. Parents taught their children to respect fire's power from an early age. They showed them how to feed flames carefully, how to shield sparks from wind, and how to distinguish between a warming fire and a dangerous blaze. These lessons were practical, but they carried deeper meaning. Children learned that fire required attention, responsibility, and humility. Fire demanded awareness. These values extended into their adult lives, shaping their interactions with others, their work, and their understanding of the world. Gibil's influence wasn't limited to craftsmen or priests. It formed part of the daily education of every family. In large cities, fire brigades didn't exist in the way we know them today, but communities developed systems for responding quickly to flames. Neighbours gathered to smother sparks, pass water, or remove flammable objects from danger. Families worked together to extinguish small fires before they grew. This collective vigilance strengthened social bonds. Firestorms taught people that the well-being of one household affected the entire neighbourhood. These shared experiences made fire not only a teacher, but a unifier. Gibil's flame shaped the social fabric as much as it shaped materials. Some cities experienced firestorms so severe that they changed the course of history. Entire districts were rebuilt with different structures or new purposes. Sometimes these changes led to expansions of temples, reorganizations of markets, or shifts in political influence. Firestorms tested resilience, but they also opened possibilities. People remembered these moments not with admiration for destruction, but with recognition of how renewal emerged afterward. The flame was not praised for consuming. It was remembered for revealing the path forward. Historically, these cycles of destruction and renewal contributed to the longevity of ancient cities. Instead of remaining static, they adapted. Instead of resisting change, they incorporated it. Firestorms prevented stagnation. They forced innovation. They sparked reflections about the materials used, the placement of forges, the closeness of dwellings, the flow of wind, and the weaknesses in construction. The renewal that followed wasn't accidental, it was intentional. Fire didn't create order on its own, but it revealed where order was needed. In the mythic understanding of Gibil, firestorms were not separate from his steady flame. They were part of the same continuum. The flame that melted ore in a forge could also reveal structural weaknesses in a home. The flame that purified tools in a temple could expose neglected practices in a neighborhood. The flame that carried prayers upward could also carry warnings. The destructive aspect of fire wasn't understood as rage, it was understood as truth, and truth, even when difficult, was valuable. People carried this understanding into every interaction with flame. They learned to approach fire with respect, not fear. They learned to prepare for its needs. They learned to rebuild without resentment. Fire's lessons were woven into culture, shaping how cities responded to challenges, how craftsmen refined their methods, how priests interpreted signs, and how families protected their homes. Through all of this, Gibil's presence remained consistent. He was not a god of unpredictable wrath or sudden punishment. He was a teacher, a companion, a guide whose flame revealed what needed to change. Even destruction carried meaning when viewed through his presence. In the quiet moments after a firestorm, when the last embers cooled and people surveyed the remains, they believed Gibil was there, not to condemn but to steady their hands as they prepared to rebuild. And as they rebuilt, they carried forward not only the memory of what was lost, but the lessons learned from the flame that had reshaped their world. The next step in Gibil's story flows into the realm of myth itself, where destruction and creation became part of a larger tapestry woven with heroes, spirits, monsters, and stories passed across generations. Stories in which fire became a force that shaped legends as much as it shaped cities. By the time cities glowed at night with the steady breath of countless flames, Gibil was no longer only the quiet companion of craftsmen, the purifier of rituals, or the guide of divination. He had also become a figure woven into the stories people told at dusk, when families gathered near lamps and children listened wide-eyed to tales about gods, creatures, and the early days of the world. These stories weren't simply entertainment. They carried lessons, warnings, memories, and ideas about how the universe worked. They explained the forces that shape the world, and because fire touched every part of life, Gibil found his way into some of the oldest legends recorded on clay tablets, or whispered across generations. His presence in mythology wasn't overwhelming or dominating. He wasn't the hero who fought endless battles, or the ruler who commanded the heavens. He didn't appear as a towering figure casting judgment. Instead, he entered stories in subtle but meaningful ways, often as the source of power behind tools, symbols, and transformations. If another god forged a weapon, Gibil's fire was there. If a hero emerged from trial by heat or darkness, his flame was part of the test. If a monster descended from the shadows with scorching breath or molten skin, people associated its nature with the same force that made metal glow. Fire in myth wasn't random. It had lineage. It had a history. And Gibil was at the centre of that history. One of the oldest themes linking Gibil to mythology is the idea of the first fire, a flame that appeared at the beginning of creation. This wasn't a literal moment described in one clear narrative. It was a concept woven into several stories across different regions of Mesopotamia. In some tales, the world began in darkness until a spark emerged from the mixing of primordial waters. That spark illuminated the first land, revealing shapes and boundaries. In these stories, Gibil wasn't portrayed as a child of conflict or chaos. He was the natural result of creation itself, an essential presence that brought clarity to the early world. This connection to beginnings influenced many myths. In stories where gods shaped the world, fire became the tool that allowed them to form mountains, seas, and structures. Even when Gibil didn't appear by name, the heat used in creation was understood to be his. A world without fire would have been cold and shapeless. A world with fire became structured, warm, and alive. These associations strengthen the idea that Gibil was present from the first moment life emerged. Another set of myths involved the forging of divine weapons. These weren't tools of war in the human sense. They were symbols, objects of immense importance that represented authority, protection, and cosmic balance. Whenever a story described a god shaping a blade, a scepter, or an emblem of power, listeners understood that the fire doing the work belonged to Gibil. He wasn't always named, but his presence was recognized. Fire was his domain, and the tools shaped in divine forges carried a part of him. Some stories described a great celestial furnace used by gods to create the first sacred objects. This furnace glowed brighter than any fire found on Earth, fueled by materials no human could gather. In these tales, Gibil tended the furnace, controlling its heat with precision. Other gods brought materials: stone from mountains, metal from the deep earth, starlight from the heavens, and Gibil shaped them into objects that guided the order of the universe. These stories reinforced the belief that craftsmanship itself was divine. Human craftsmen imitated the work of gods, and their fires were humble echoes of Gibil's cosmic furnace. Myths involving monsters and strange beings also carried traces of Gibil's influence. Many ancient cultures created stories to explain natural dangers, environmental events, or mysterious forces. In Mesopotamian tradition, some creatures were described as born from fire or shaped by extreme heat. These beings weren't always villains. Some acted as guardians, while others posed challenges to heroes. Their connection to fire made them powerful but not invincible. They reflected the same duality found in Gibil's nature, capable of destruction, but also representing transformation. One story tells of a creature that lived deep beneath the earth, a being whose body glowed with molten heat. It guarded a hidden cavern filled with metals and minerals. The creature wasn't portrayed as malicious. It protected what lay beneath the earth. Heroes who sought these materials for grand tasks had to approach the creature with caution. In the story, they didn't defeat it. They learned from it how to withstand heat, how to understand the nature of flame, how to work with the materials the creature guarded. Gibil's presence in this story was subtle. The creature's molten body was described as born of the same fire that shaped the first tools. That line alone told listeners who influenced the creature's origin. Other stories feature more fearsome beings, creatures that unleashed scorching winds or breathed sparks when angered. These beings represented the unpredictable side of fire, the storms that swept through cities, the sudden flare-ups in workshops, the natural disasters caused by extreme heat. But even in these frightening tales, fire wasn't depicted as evil. It was depicted as powerful. The heroes who overcame these creatures often succeeded not through brute strength, but through understanding, recognizing how fire moved, how it needed fuel, how it responded to air. These stories taught practical lessons disguised in mythic form. Listeners learned the behavior of fire by hearing how heroes dealt with fiery challenges. Gibil's presence lingered in every lesson. One of the most intriguing mythic threads involving Gibil was his connection to purity and truth. Fire revealed honesty. It exposed impurities in metal. It clarified what was hidden. In stories about disputes among gods or heroes, fire was sometimes used to test the truth. A character who claimed innocence might walk through flame or hold heated metal to prove sincerity. Listeners didn't believe the flame itself judged them. They believed Gibil guided the flame. If the person emerged unscathed, it was a sign that the god of fire had recognized truth in their words. If they were harmed, it suggested they had not been honest. These stories weren't literal instructions for behavior. They reinforced cultural values: truth, courage, transparency, and the belief that deception could not withstand heat. Children grew up hearing tales of heroes who survived fire thanks to their courage or purity, and these stories shaped their understanding of integrity. They learned that fire demanded honesty, because Gibil's flame revealed everything. These myths shaped moral lessons without sounding like rules. They connected ethics to natural behaviour. Just as fire separated pure metal from impurities, truth separated honourable actions from dishonourable ones. Some stories placed Gibil in the company of other gods, not as a follower, but as a partner. When gods gathered to make decisions, fire represented clarity. When gods needed to seal agreements, fire acted as witness. When gods faced challenges from cosmic forces, fire became a stabilizing presence. Gibil didn't dominate conversations or direct events. His role was steady, like the flame itself. He was the one who made everything visible, who ensured that nothing remained hidden in shadows. Even in myths involving storms, floods, or darkness, fire played a part. In tales of great deluges or long nights where the world became cold and silent, the reappearance of fire marked the return of hope. Heroes trapped in darkness found their way by a single flame that refused to die. Families devastated by disaster rebuilt their lives beginning with the moment they rekindled a hearth. These stories reminded listeners that fire was the symbol of resilience. It survived, even when everything else was uncertain. Gibi's flame was the reason life could continue after calamity. Some legends describe Gibil teaching early humans how to control fire. These tales weren't dramatic in the sense of theft or rebellion, like the later stories of Prometheus in Greek tradition. Instead, they portrayed Gibil as a patient guide. He didn't steal fire from the heavens, he didn't defy other gods, he simply revealed knowledge. He showed early humans how to maintain a flame, how to use it safely, how to respect its power. These stories emphasized cooperation rather than conflict. Fire wasn't a forbidden power. It was a shared resource that required understanding. Ancient listeners found comfort in the idea that fire was not a stolen secret, but a gift shared responsibly. Another type of myth portrayed Gibil as the patron of artisans. In these stories, he visited craftsmen in dreams, offering guidance about the heat needed to shape a particular metal or the best way to build a kiln. He didn't appear in physical form. His presence was felt through the glow of the furnace, the steadying of a flame, or the moment when a difficult piece of pottery emerged perfect from the kiln. These stories reinforced the belief that skill came from partnership, between humans and flame, between craftsmen and Gibil. Legends involving fire also offered explanations for natural phenomena. A volcanic eruption might be explained as Gibil stirring deep beneath the ground. A lightning strike igniting a field might be interpreted as a sign that the area needed renewal. A particularly strong flame in a workshop might be seen as encouragement from the god. These interpretations weren't literal. They were ways of understanding the unpredictable world. Fire was a force people could observe closely, and myth gave that observation cultural meaning. Perhaps the most complex myths involving Gibil focused on transformation. Transformation was the essence of fire. It changed everything it touched. Stories about transformations, heroes becoming hardened through trials, gods shaping the world, monsters being defeated through clever use of heat, often reflected fire's role. In some stories, a simple spark changed the course of events. A torch in a dark cavern revealed a hidden truth. A glowing coal helped a character survive long enough to deliver an important message. A forge fire allowed a craftsman to create something that shifted the fate of a city. These stories reminded listeners that change often began with something small, something humble, something that grew quietly until it became powerful enough to alter lives. Myths about Gibil didn't end in triumph or tragedy. They ended in clarity. The flame offered understanding. Whether it illuminated a dark space, purified a material, shaped a tool, or revealed a truth, fire made things visible. Gibil's presence in stories wasn't about dominance, it was about awareness. the myths guided people toward the same conclusion. The flame was never only practical, it carried meaning, it taught, it revealed. In every story that mentioned fire, whether describing gods forging tools, heroes surviving trials, monsters emerging from the earth, or cities rebuilding after disaster, Gibil's influence shaped how people understood the world. He was always there, steady and quiet, in the background of mythic landscapes. His flame gave form to creation, courage to heroes, danger to monsters, and renewal to civilizations. And as these stories spread across generations, they shaped not only the imagination of the people, but their rituals, their crafts, and their understanding of divine presence. The next part of Gibil's tale moves into the world of scholars and skeptics, people who studied these myths with curiosity, trying to understand whether the stories of fire reflected real historical memories or symbolic truths carried through the ages. By the time the ancient world gave way to new empires and new ways of thinking, the stories of many early gods began to fade. Some deities remained central, carried by strong cults, powerful temples, or long-standing rituals. Others stayed alive only in fragments, perhaps mentioned in a line of an old hymn, or depicted faintly on a broken tablet. And some, like Gibil, slipped quietly into the background. Not erased, not rejected, but simply overshadowed by larger systems of belief that grew more dominant as centuries passed. Yet for scholars who dedicate their lives to understanding the earliest layers of human civilization, these quieter gods often become some of the most intriguing. What disappears leaves questions. What remains in ashes invites careful study. Scholars of the ancient Near East don't talk about Gibil the way storytellers once did. They don't describe him in terms of glowing furnaces or whispered legends told beside hearth fires. They speak of him through tablets, inscriptions, archaeological findings and patterns hidden in language. Their work involves piecing together traces, small clues that survive the erosion of time, a name etched on a damaged brick, a reference buried in a list of offerings, a hymn where his role appears beside more dominant gods. Each discovery raises new questions. Did people worship him widely? Was his influence local or regional? How did his role evolve over time? And, perhaps most importantly, why did a god connected to something as essential as fire begin to fade from the forefront of mythology? The search for Gibil begins with language. Ancient Mesopotamian languages like Sumerian and Akkadian preserved his name in various forms. On some tablets, he appears as Gibil, on others as Gera or Gira. Different dialects and periods use different names, but the associations remain similar: fire, heat, purification, craftsmanship. Scholars started by tracking these names across thousands of tablets. They compared how often he appeared relative to other gods. They examined the titles used alongside his name. Titles reveal status. A god called king or lord held different significance from one called protector or messenger. Gibil's titles tended to be ones connected to function. He who purifies, the burner, the flame of the gods. These titles help scholars understand his sphere of influence, but also hinted at why he eventually became less prominent. His role was essential, but it was also practical, and sometimes practical gods, despite shaping daily life, don't command the same long-term mythic attention as gods associated with large political or cosmic domains. Archaeologists searching for Gibil's presence often comb through temple inventories, lists of offerings stored, distributed or consumed during rituals. These administrative tablets rarely describe events in poetic language. They are straightforward records, but buried within them are clues. One temple list might mention offerings of oil for a flame dedicated to Gira. Another might describe a small shrine room that held a perpetual fire. A third might detail a set of metal tools sanctified in the name of the fire god. These references don't provide full stories, but they paint a picture of everyday reverence. Gibil wasn't a distant figure of mythic grandeur. He was a presence folded into routine temple activity. Some scholars believe that Gibil's quiet presence in these administrative records suggests that he was integrated so deeply into daily rituals that people didn't need dramatic myths to keep him alive. He existed in the work of craftsmen, the flames of workshops, the incense burned during ceremonies. He didn't require heroic tales to reinforce his importance. Fire ensured his relevance. But this practical integration also meant that when larger religious shifts occurred, gods who relied less on myth and more on daily use could fade into obscurity. People still used fire, but they didn't always attach Gibil's name to it. Over time, reverence became habit, and habit eventually became assumption. One of the most interesting challenges for scholars studying Gibil is the lack of monumental temples dedicated solely to him. While many major gods had temples that dominated city skylines, Gibil's presence often appeared in smaller spaces, workshops, kilns, forge areas, and side rooms of larger temples. Fire didn't need grand architecture to serve its function. As a result, Gibil's worship wasn't built into the city through monumental structures that could withstand millennia of erosion. Instead, it was woven into the smaller, more fragile places where flame was worked and understood. This has made archaeological traces rare. A workshop floor stained with signs of heat, a kiln whose bricks carry symbols of dedication, a set of tools found near an offering bowl. These small details often offer the most insight. Some researchers argue that Gibil's decline in prominence wasn't a disappearance but a transformation. As civilizations merged, conquered, or blended with others, gods often absorbed the roles or identities of earlier deities. Fire gods across the ancient Near East frequently merged with solar deities, or gods associated with war, purity, or judgment. In some periods, Gibil's attributes became absorbed into the larger figure of Shamash, the sun god. Shamash governed light, justice, truth, and clarity, concepts not far removed from the symbolic functions of fire. In this merging, Gibil didn't vanish. His qualities were integrated into a more central deity. Scholars discuss these transitions carefully, tracing how rituals once dedicated to Gibil later appear in texts involving other gods. The continuity suggests that while his name may have faded, his influence persisted. Another theory proposes that Gibil's decline reflects the rise of increasingly complex theological systems. As cities grew and empires expanded, religious hierarchies became more structured. Major gods took on broader roles, while lesser or specialized gods became associated with narrower domains. A god of fire might have been too specialized to remain central in an era when people needed deities to govern everything from kingship to law to cosmic order. Large-scale political systems tended to favor gods who mirrored their structure. Powerful, commanding figures whose stories reinforced authority. Gibil's domain, although essential, remained tightly tied to material processes. Fire shaped civilization, but it didn't command armies or govern moral codes. Scholars who study this period note how cultural priorities influenced which gods remained prominent. Yet despite this shift, traces of Gibil continue to appear in unexpected places. A set of incantations from the Old Babylonian period includes prayers invoking him for protection against illness. In these texts, fire doesn't harm, it cleanses. Gibil's flame purifies homes and drives away dangerous influences. The wording suggests that his role extended beyond workshops and temples. People believed his presence protected them from unseen forces. While not a central figure in mythic epics, he remained a practical guardian, invoked during moments that blended health, survival, and vulnerability. Other tablets describe him in connection with craftsmanship. Hymns honouring smiths or metalworkers sometimes included verses dedicated to the fire that made their work possible. Scholars analysing these hymns note that the language used reflects deep respect. Gibil wasn't portrayed as an unpredictable or destructive force. He was steady, reliable, and necessary. The flame he embodied enabled creativity, strengthened tools, and purified materials. These hymns suggest an intimate relationship between humans and their work, a relationship Gibil symbolized. As scholars examine these texts, they often wonder how widely Gibil was worshipped. Was he a household god, a workshop god, a temple presence, or all of these at once? The evidence suggests that he didn't fit neatly into a single category. He appeared wherever fire appeared, across classes, professions, spaces, and rituals. Because his domain crossed so many boundaries, pinpointing his exact place in religious structures is challenging. His absence from major temples doesn't diminish his significance. It simply reflects the kind of god he was, accessible, useful, ever-present in everyday life. Another layer of scholarly inquiry examines how Gibil was depicted in art. Unlike gods associated with kingship or warfare, Gibil rarely appears in grand carvings or monumental sculptures. But he does appear in small artifacts, seal impressions, decorative items and metal objects. On some seals, a small flame symbol accompanies a figure performing a ritual. In others, tiny motifs resembling rising smoke-mark scenes involving purification. These subtle symbols are easy to overlook, but scholars recognize them as references to Gibil's presence. Art from this period was deliberate. Even a simple symbol carried meaning. One of the puzzles that scholars continue to examine is how a god so closely tied to something universal became nearly forgotten in later literature. The practical explanation is that fire became so embedded in daily life that people stopped assigning it a single divine identity. Fire was everywhere. It felt natural, ordinary. Although it retained its symbolic power, the need to personify it may have diminished. People continued to use fire, rely on it, respect it, but they didn't always speak Gibil's name while doing so. Over time, this silence gradually erased him from common memory, even as his domain remained essential. Yet the scholars who study these periods understand something important. Forgotten does not mean unimportant. The gods who shaped daily life often left the fewest monumental traces because their worship lived in small acts rather than grand rituals. Gibil wasn't a god of empires. He was a god of the home, the workshop, the temple courtyard, the kiln, the forge, the lamp, the hearth. His presence was in the glow that made night less frightening, the heat that shaped clay, the flame that purified offerings, the fire that carried prayers upward. He was woven into the earliest expressions of communal life. Modern researchers sift through layers of soil searching for clues that survived floods, earthquakes, fires, and decay. They handle tablets that crumble at the edges, hoping to decipher one more line of text. They examine microscopic fragments of soot on kiln bricks to determine how ancient fires were managed. They piece together offering lists, ritual instructions, and administrative records. They compare the names of gods across different regions and periods. Every piece of evidence helps them understand the role Gibil once held. Some scholars write about him with a kind of quiet admiration. They see him as a symbol of the practical intelligence that shaped early societies. They see him in the evolution of kilns, the precision of metalwork, the development of pottery, the rise of temple rituals. They see him in the choices people made when building homes, crafting tools, or interpreting signs. Gibil's story is not one of grand epics or cosmic battles. It's a story of presence, a presence that guided the earliest experiments in human creativity. The search for a forgotten god isn't only about finding his name in texts or identifying his symbols in art. It's about understanding how people lived, how they interpreted the world, and how they built the foundations of civilization. In the ashes of ancient workshops, in the soot of old kilns, in the faint lines of prayers burned into clay tablets, scholars find traces of a deity who shaped the way humans interacted with one of the most transformative forces in nature. Even though Gibil's name faded from common worship, his legacy remains embedded in the practices that fire made possible. The next part of his story reaches beyond myth and scholarship, exploring how modern understanding of science and technology reveals deeper truths hidden within the myths. Truths about heat, transformation, energy, and the human need to make sense of powerful forces through stories passed from one generation to the next. By the time myths about Gibil filtered into memories, rituals, workshops, and half-faded tablets, people had already lived with fire for so many generations that they no longer questioned its importance. It shaped their homes, their cities, their tools, and their imagination. Fire had never been a mystery in the sense of being unknown. People understood its behaviour through experience, but they didn't understand why it behaved the way it did. They didn't have the scientific language for combustion, temperature, oxidation, or chemical reactions. They didn't know why certain metals softened before others, or why some clays held their shape in kilns while others crumbled. They didn't understand how heat travelled, or why smoke moved in certain ways. What they had was observation. Careful, repeated, intergenerational observation. And from that observation, they built stories. The myths surrounding Gibil did not emerge from fantasy. They emerged from attempts to explain what people witnessed every day. In a world without scientific frameworks, stories became the earliest form of technology. They taught cause, effect, risk, and possibility. They preserved knowledge in ways that were easy to remember and pass along. And while the stories spoke of gods, monsters, heroes, and flames that lived or breathed, the lessons hidden inside them reflected a deep understanding of fire's properties. When ancient storytellers described Gibil as the purifier, they weren't inventing a metaphor. They were describing a scientific fact observed countless times. Fire drove insects away from grain. It killed harmful organisms on tools and surfaces. It made water boil and become safer to drink. When people burned materials to prepare for rituals, they didn't understand sterilization, but they understood the result. Tools heated in fire were cleaner, safer, and more reliable. Gibil's role in purification grew directly from these observations. Fire transformed the dangerous into the safe. It simplified, reduced, and cleansed. Myth turned this process into a divine act, but the underlying knowledge was practical. The same is true for fire's transformative power. Myths about Gibil shaping the world, crafting tools, or tending a cosmic furnace reflect the earliest understanding of metallurgy. Metalworkers learned through trial and error which stones contained workable metal, how much heat was needed to extract it, and how different fuels changed the temperature of a flame. They didn't describe these processes with chemistry. They described them with gods. If a fire grew hot enough to soften ore, they believed Gibil was guiding the heat. If a metal cracked or burned, they believed something had gone wrong in the partnership between craftsman and flame. These interpretations carried real instructional value. A story about a god controlling the heat taught craftsmen that heat must be controlled. A myth describing Gibil testing metals reminded apprentices to observe carefully. A tale about a flame refusing to cooperate reinforced the importance of clean fuel, proper airflow, and correct timing. Myths preserved scientific knowledge in forms accessible to everyone, even those who could not read. They ensured that skills remained stable across generations. Smoke played a similar role. In myths where priests read omens in smoke, the practice seemed spiritual at first glance. But beneath that spirituality lies a deep understanding of atmospheric conditions. Priests studying smoke learned how humidity changed burn patterns, how wind direction shifted, how different fuels produced specific colours or densities. They learned that thick smoke indicated impurities or insufficient oxygen, while thin smoke suggested cleaner combustion. They didn't describe these mechanics in technical terms. They described them as signs from Gibil. But the signs themselves preserved environmental knowledge that helped farmers predict weather, helped builders understand ventilation, and helped firekeepers maintain safe flames. Even myths involving firestorms or destructive flames contained scientific insights. Stories of creatures born from molten earth or fire that emerged from under the ground reflect early encounters with volcanic activity. People living near volcanic regions didn't understand tectonics, but they observed patterns: smoke rising before eruptions, ground trembling, heat emanating from cracks. They wrapped these observations into stories about beings that lived deep in the earth, emerging only when disturbed. These myths preserved crucial warnings. If people heard rumblings or saw heat shimmering from the ground, they knew danger might follow. Gibil's association with these fiery forces acknowledged the connection between familiar fire and its larger, unpredictable manifestations in nature. The technological insights hidden in myths also appear in stories about the creation of bricks and pottery. Ancient people didn't understand the molecular changes that occurred when clay was fired. They didn't know why some clays hardened well while others cracked, but they knew through practice that heat strengthened materials in ways nothing else could. Myths describing Gibil hardening the foundation of the world reflect this understanding. Just as clay became stronger in fire, the world itself became stable when exposed to divine heat. The metaphor carried technological truth. Heat created durability. When myths described Gibil revealing truth, they weren't referring to philosophical clarity. They were describing a physical phenomenon. Heat exposes impurities. In metallurgy, this is especially clear. When metal is heated, impurities rise to the surface or burn away. Craftsmen learned to read these signs. A story about Gibil shining light on deception reinforced that fire reveals what is hidden. The idea that truth withstands heat while lies burn away wasn't invented to teach morality. It came directly from observing molten metal being purified. The moral lessons came later. The science came first. In myths about transformation, fire often marks a moment of change. Heroes who pass through flames become stronger. Objects tempered in fire become sharper. Places ravaged by fire become fertile. These stories mirror the technological realities of the ancient world. Fire changed everything, from landscapes to materials to social structures. It facilitated agriculture, metallurgy, construction, ritual cleansing, and even cooking methods that improved health. When myths framed fire as the force that shaped identity or destiny, they reflected how deeply heat shaped material reality. Many myths also contain early observations about energy transfer. When stories describe Gibil lending his heat to another god or infusing objects with power, they mirror the way heat must be transferred from fuel to objects in practical settings. A blacksmith needed to understand how quickly heat moved from flames to metal. A potter needed to know how evenly heat reached clay. Myths translated these principles into narratives. A god transferring strength, or warmth, through fire taught listeners that heat itself was a form of power, something that could move, affect, and transform the world. When priests used flame to determine the success of a ritual, they weren't only relying on spiritual interpretation, they were observing chemical reactions. Certain incense burns more evenly when the mixture is prepared correctly. If the smoke rises smoothly, it reflects precise blending of ingredients. If it sputters or thickens, it may signal issues with moisture content or fuel quality. These practical details became encoded in ritual language. Gibil's approval wasn't only a matter of divine will, it reflected careful craftsmanship and environmental awareness. Ancient myths also reveal early understandings of temperature control. When stories describe Gibil calming flames, commanding heat, or stabilizing fires for divine tasks, they reflect the reality of ancient forges. Temperature control was one of the most challenging aspects of early metallurgy. Too much heat, and metal could lose structure. Too little, and it wouldn't soften. Craftsmen learned this balance over centuries. Myths turned that hard-earned experience into narrative, where divine guidance replaced trial and error. There is technological insight even in myths describing rituals of fire purification. Burning incense to cleanse temples, passing torches over objects, or using flame to sanctify spaces reflects early understanding of smoke's ability to mask odours, repel insects, and create sterile environments. Priests didn't understand microbial activity, but they saw that sick rooms with smoke were less prone to further illness. Myth gave meaning to the observation, attributing purification to Gibil's presence. The way myths describe the relationship between fire and breath also holds scientific truth. Many stories portray fire as alive because it consumes air, grows with fuel, and dies without nourishment. These descriptions mirror combustion principles. People saw fire behave like a living thing. It needed food, air, and protection. They noticed that covering a flame extinguished it. They observed that wind strengthened or weakened it. These insights informed myths that described fire as a presence that breathed, hungered, or rested. When ancient texts mention Gibil illuminating the heavens or guiding distant journeys, they sometimes refer to the use of torches, lamps, or signal fires. Large empires used fire for communication, lighting, navigation, and organisation. Watchtowers signalled with flame, caravans moved by lamplight, temples aligned their rituals with the movement of stars, and fire was the medium that connected earth to sky. Myths, framing Gibil as a guide, reflect this practical role. Fire helped people see the world. Myths said Gibil helped people understand it. Some myths describe Gibil as a force that separates order from chaos, not through judgment, but through illumination. This aligns with early human experience. Darkness obscured danger. Fire revealed it. With fire, people saw predators, obstacles, and threats they couldn't see before. The idea that Gibil brought clarity wasn't symbolic, it was literal. Flame allowed people to understand their surroundings. Knowledge came from light. Even myths involving destruction contain elements of scientific truth. When stories describe fire consuming old structures so new ones can be built, they reflect natural cycles. Burned fields become fertile. Destroyed buildings are replaced with improved ones. Firestorms expose weaknesses in construction, prompting better design. Myths placed these ideas within a divine framework so communities could understand the purpose behind difficult events. The underlying lesson was about resilience, adaptation, and renewal. For modern scholars, these myths become windows into ancient science. They reveal how early people understood energy, transformation, and natural forces long before scientific terminology existed. The myths didn't distort reality. They translated it into the language of the time. They preserved empirical knowledge through story, ritual, and symbol. In many cases, the mythic explanation and the scientific explanation describe the same phenomenon, just in different terms. Gibil's myths aren't only stories about a fire god. They are records of early technological logic. They mark the moment when human beings first recognized that fire was not just a tool, but a system, one that required understanding, respect, and adaptability. They show the earliest attempts to categorize heat, observe patterns, define processes, and create repeatable techniques. Myths carried this knowledge across generations, ensuring continuity long before written science existed. The more deeply scholars study these myths, the more they realize that ancient people had a sophisticated grasp of fire's behavior. They may not have used modern vocabulary, but they understood temperature gradients, fuel properties, airflow, and material transformation. They learned through experience, and they encoded that experience in stories that kept their technological world alive. Through these myths, Gibil becomes more than a forgotten god. He becomes a bridge between ancient technology and modern science. His stories reveal the intelligence of early societies, their desire to understand the world, and their determination to pass that understanding forward. And the next part of his legacy explores why, even after his name faded and his temples disappeared, people continued to feel a quiet connection to the flame. How the memory of fire's companionship shaped cultures long after the myths themselves dissolved into history. By the time centuries turned into millennia, and one civilization after another rose, fell, merged and transformed, the earliest gods of the ancient world began to drift into memory. Some endured because their temples became political centres. Some survived because their names were woven into lore, kingship, or the founding myths of empires. Others remained alive in rituals that never lost their relevance. But many deities whose presence shaped daily life, gods connected to craft, household stability, healing practices, or natural forces, gradually slipped out of focus. Not because they became unimportant, but because they were woven so deeply into routine that their names were no longer spoken with the same urgency. Gibil, the god of fire, belonged to this quiet category. He never demanded grandeur. He didn't claim dominion over cities or kings. He didn't control vast stretches of sky or ocean. He didn't lead armies of divine beings or punish mortals with dramatic displays of power. He lived in workshops, in hearths, in the glow of lamps, in small braziers burning in household courtyards, in the warm halos of temple altars. His presence was essential, but it wasn't theatrical, and as belief systems evolved, it was often the quieter gods who faded first. The decline of Gibil's prominence didn't happen suddenly. It developed gradually through a combination of cultural changes, linguistic shifts, political consolidations, and theological reorganizations. Scholars describe this process with patience, examining fragmented evidence, comparing regional traditions, and considering the broader historical context. But even without scholarly analysis, the pattern feels natural. In societies where religion shaped daily life, attention moved toward gods whose influence could be invoked in matters of war, weather, justice, kingship, or cosmic stability. The practical gods remained respected, but their roles subtly transformed into background forces rather than central figures. Fire itself never lost importance. People continued to rely on it. They continued to respect it. But as religious systems developed hierarchies and pantheons, fire became a domain rather than a deity. Gibil was no longer the singular figure overseeing flame. His qualities merged into broader categories: light associated with solar deities, purification linked to larger gods with expanded portfolios, craftsmanship connected to patron gods of metalwork or construction. This merging wasn't disrespectful. It was a form of evolution. The spiritual world rearranged itself to reflect how societies grew more complex. The earliest layers of Sumerian religion included many gods with specific practical domains. As Mesopotamian civilization matured, new generations inherited pantheons already reorganized by political and cultural forces. Empires needed unifying symbols. Kings needed gods who represented authority. Priests needed deities who governed cosmic order. Fire, steady, dependable, functional, did not occupy these roles. And so Gibil, who once shaped the earliest expressions of human creativity, became less visible. But even as his name appeared less frequently in major temple hymns or political inscriptions, traces of him continued to appear in the places where fire itself remained essential. His presence lived on indirectly, in rituals, techniques, and customs passed down long after people stopped attaching his name to them. A potter lighting a kiln still followed steps shaped by millennia of fire-keeping tradition. A metalworker adjusting airflow to control furnace temperature still relied on knowledge that began in Gibil's earliest worship. A priest lighting incense still followed patterns rooted in rituals that once invoked the god of fire. Families maintaining hearths still tended flames using methods inherited from ancestors who honoured him. Gibil didn't remain as a named figure. He remained as memory embedded in practice. This is often how practical gods survive, not through temples or hymns, but through habits that outlast written history. People forget the stories, but not the techniques. They forget the titles, but not the movements. They forget the rituals, but not the logic behind them. Gibil's legacy persisted because fire persisted. In every spark, every controlled burn, every piece of pottery hardened by heat, every tool shaped in a furnace, every lamp lit in the dark, his memory remained unspoken but present. When scholars examine this transition, they often emphasize how changing economics influenced religious evolution. As cities grew more interconnected through trade, new gods from neighbouring regions entered the cultural landscape. When Assyria absorbed Babylon, Babylon shaped Assyria, and both shaped the beliefs of countless smaller groups. Pantheons blended. Some gods rose in prominence because they symbolized the political power of empires. Others faded because their roles were absorbed by higher-ranking deities. Gibil's domain, for example, shared similarities with aspects of Shamash, the sun god. Over time, the heat and illumination associated with fire became part of the solar deity's broader authority. In this way, Gibil's essence didn't disappear, it migrated. Language played a role as well. The earliest references to Gibil come from Sumerian texts. Later periods used Akkadian. As languages changed, some gods kept their names while others adapted or were replaced. Gibil's name existed in several variants: Gibil, Gira, Gera, which at times made it challenging for scribes to maintain consistency across regions. When a god's identity splinters through linguistic variation, it becomes easier for later generations to lose track of the connections. Over time, the linguistic trail thins. Names merge or are replaced. Gibil's multiple names reveal his widespread but diffuse presence, and diffuseness is difficult to track in a world where gods needed clear roles to stay prominent in organised religious systems. Another factor in his quiet decline was the changing nature of power. As temples grew in size and influence, major gods became symbols of authority. The gods who protected justice, kingship, fertility, and cosmic order became the focus of elaborate rituals and state support. Gibil, whose role was intimately tied to daily life rather than political structures, did not receive the same institutional backing. His worship didn't require large temples or expensive ceremonies. A flame in a workshop or hearth sufficed. As institutional religion became more centralized, gods without politically significant roles tended to recede into smaller spaces. Yet the most compelling reason Gibil's name faded may be the simplest. Fire no longer felt mysterious. In the earliest days, fire was a wonder. It was precious, difficult to control, unpredictable, and essential. A single spark could change the course of a family or a village. Fire demanded guardianship. It demanded respect. It felt like a living presence. It made sense to imagine a god within it, guiding it, teaching it, balancing its dangers with its gifts. But as people grew confident in their ability to harness fire, it became more familiar. Techniques improved. Predictability increased. Methods passed from parent to child ensured that even novices understood how to handle flame. When something becomes familiar, it rarely retains the sacred aura it once held. The wonder fades. The reverence softens. People continue to respect fire, but they no longer needed a divine intermediary to understand it. Gibil was a guide during a time when fire was still learning to coexist with humanity. Once humans mastered fire, they carried the god's lessons with them, but not always his name. Even so, complete disappearance is rare in human memory. Some gods leave only faint echoes, but those echoes shape cultures long after the names vanish. Gibil's memory burns quietly in the ways people still respond to flame. Humans instinctively gather around fire. They feel comfort in its warmth. They feel caution in its unpredictability. They find clarity in its light. They recognize purification in its heat. These responses don't come from logic alone. They come from a shared ancestral experience that stretches back to the first sparks ever nurtured. Modern understanding of fire still divides it into two categories: useful and dangerous. Ancient people made the same distinction, but they expressed it through divine presence. Gibil represented the balance between these two forces, and although his name is rarely spoken today, His presence is still felt whenever someone tends a flame with respect, or uses heat to create, or cleanses something through fire, or watches sparks drift upward in a dark room and feels something older than memory. His quiet survival shows itself in cultural habits too. Many traditions still use fire in rituals of purification, remembrance, transition, and celebration. Candles remain symbols of clarity in times of confusion. Controlled burns remain essential for ecosystems. Fireworks, bonfires, and ceremonial flames mark important moments across cultures. None of these practices name Gibil, but all of them reflect the same understanding ancient people carried. Fire transforms, it reveals, it unites, it marks turning points. Even scientific curiosity reflects echoes of his memory. The study of combustion, energy, heat, and transformation continues to fascinate people. Students learning about chemical reactions still watch flames with the same attentive focus ancient priests once did, noting colour, movement, and intensity. Engineers designing engines or furnaces still rely on principles shaped by generations of trial and error. Fire remains one of the earliest technologies humans mastered, and Gibil remains the symbol of that mastery, even if his name has faded. This form of quiet survival happens often in human history. Certain figures disappear from text, but their influence remains embedded in the world they helped shape. If Gibil was the guide who taught humanity how to live with fire, then every flame still carries the legacy of that partnership. Not through temples or prayers, but through the simple act of lighting a fire with intention, care and understanding. And so Gibil did not vanish. He transformed. He became part of the knowledge that fire itself holds. His memory lives not in elaborate myths or monumental architecture, but in the ordinary gestures that have defined human life for tens of thousands of years. He lives in the steady routines of cooks, blacksmiths, potters, and craftsmen. He lives in the quiet comfort of hearths, the glow of lamps, the warmth that gathers people together. He lives in the flicker that has accompanied humanity since the first spark jumped from stone to tinder. The next part of his story carries this sense of continuity forward, exploring how even today, long after his name faded from temple walls, the quiet memory of a fire god still shapes how people understand creativity, renewal, and the steady glow that warms the human spirit. By the time a god's name dissolves into the past, when temples crumble and languages shift and myths fade into fragments scattered across museums and excavated tablets, it can seem as though the figure at the centre of those stories vanishes entirely. Yet when it comes to a presence like Gibil, the quiet god of fire, the companion of craftsmen, the purifier of rituals, the guide behind the glow of ancient hearths, something different happens. He becomes part of the world in ways that are harder to see directly but easier to feel. The flame he symbolized continues to burn. The lessons he represented continue to guide. The memory of his presence continues in the gestures, habits, and instincts people still carry today, long after they stopped whispering his name. Fire has always been more than a tool. It has been a marker of human identity. It has shaped the way people gather, work, create, understand time, and navigate darkness. When early humans first learned to keep a flame alive, they changed the trajectory of their development. They gained warmth, protection, cooked food, extended day into night, and discovered materials and technologies that would never have existed without fire. Every generation after that inherited the knowledge, and even though no one attributes that inheritance to a deity in a literal sense anymore, the symbolic presence of a fire god lives within those traditions. Gibil's relevance today isn't a matter of belief, it's a matter of awareness, of noticing how deeply fire still sits at the centre of human experience, even in an age where electricity has replaced torches and furnaces are controlled by switches instead of fuels tended by careful hands. People don't live beside open flames in the same way ancient Mesopotamians did, yet fire hasn't disappeared. It has simply changed form. The intimacy of it has shifted, but the reliance remains. Every time a stove ignites with a sudden click and a small, controlled flame rises, the ancient relationship between humanity and fire continues. Every time metal is forged for industry, or ceramics are fired in a kiln, or engines combust fuel to push machines forward, the elemental force that shaped the earliest tools is present. People may not see Gibil in those flames, but the role he once played, guiding, shaping, teaching, still echoes through these processes. His presence also lingers in smaller, quieter ways. People light candles to remember loved ones, to bring calm into a room, to accompany moments of reflection. They gather around campfires during evening conversations. They watch fireplaces during winter nights. They feel something instinctively soothing about the slow rhythm of moving flames. These responses aren't tied to myth anymore, but the mythic connection is still inside the response. Ancient people felt the same comfort, the same sense of safety, the same quiet moments of thoughtfulness in front of a flame. The continuity of that feeling stretches across thousands of years. Fire also continues to represent transformation. When people talk about burning away distractions, clutter, or outdated habits, they echo the ancient understanding of fire as a cleansing force. When people describe being tempered by experience, they borrow language that began in forges. When new beginnings are marked symbolically with flames at celebrations or festivals, the ritual reflects ideas embedded in humanity's earliest relationship with Gibil's domain. In these moments, the god is not present as a figure, but as a memory woven into the structure of human thought. Modern science also mirrors insights hidden in Gibil's stories. Heat transforms physical matter. Energy flows through systems in predictable ways. Combustion requires oxygen and fuel. All the principles ancient people interpreted through myth now form the foundation of chemistry and engineering. Yet the curiosity that drives scientific exploration echoes the same curiosity that led ancient priests to watch smoke rising into the night sky, searching for patterns and meaning. Though the language has changed, the wonder remains. People still look into flames when they want to think. They still connect warmth with safety. They still use fire to mark beginnings. Candles on a birthday cake, torches at ceremonies, lanterns at vigils. They still rely on heat to cook food, purify materials, reshape objects, and bring comfort. These everyday interactions carry the silent memory of the teachings once embodied by Gibil. A forgotten god remains relevant not by name, but by influence. This influence can be seen in the way fire continues to inspire creativity. Artists use glass-blowing furnaces to create forms that could not exist without controlled heat. Potters shape vessels that undergo the same transformation ancient craftspeople relied on. Blacksmiths, though far fewer in number than in ancient times, still treat fire as a partner rather than a tool. They read its temperature by colour, listen to its sound, and feel the air surrounding it shift as it grows or diminishes. These crafts link past and present. A modern blacksmith adjusting a forge may never have heard of Gibil, but the gestures he makes mirror those performed by craftsmen thousands of years ago. Even more surprising is how fire shapes emotional experience. People describe passion as a flame, determination as a spark, resilience as something that rises, like embers glowing into life. These metaphors are so common that they feel natural. Yet they began when people first used fire to understand their own inner world. Ancient myths personified emotions in terms of heat, light, and transformation. Today, the language remains. People still think of their internal struggles in terms of burning, tempering, igniting, or cooling. Gibil's symbolic legacy persists in the mind, woven into words and reflexes. The modern world often distances people from the elemental forces that shaped early human development. Electricity replaces flame. Digital tools replace manual heat-based crafts. Climate-controlled environments remove the need for hearths. But this distance doesn't erase the ancient connection. It simply hides it beneath layers of technology. Yet whenever a power outage occurs and people reach instinctively for candles, something older than modern life reappears. The flame becomes a comfort again, a reminder of human resilience, a return to the oldest partnership humanity knows. What Gibil means today isn't about reviving ancient worship or rediscovering forgotten rituals. It's about recognizing the continuity of experience, how the same flame that shaped early civilization still shapes modern life in quiet, persistent ways. His memory burns quietly in the ways people respond to fire as both tool and symbol. It also burns in the lessons fire continues to teach. Fire shows that creation and destruction exist together. It shows that transformation requires heat, pressure, and patience. It shows that clarity emerges when light is present. It shows that old structures sometimes need to be burned away for renewal to occur. These ideas, expressed in mythology, remain relevant in personal growth, community development, and technological innovation. A forgotten god becomes meaningful not because people remember his name, but because they continue to apply the knowledge he once represented. Gibil's legacy is the human ability to adapt, to learn, to reshape materials, to create through trial and error, and to find comfort in warmth and illumination. That legacy does not depend on temples or rituals. It lives in the human relationship with fire itself. Modern life moves quickly, filled with light sources that ignite without effort and heat sources that operate invisibly behind panels and wires. Yet fire still holds a unique place in the imagination. People pause to watch flames in a fireplace, or at a campsite in ways they don't pause to watch electric bulbs. There is something alive in fire, or at least something that feels alive. Something unpredictable enough to demand attention, yet familiar enough to provide comfort. Ancient people describe this presence in terms of a deity. Modern people describe it in terms of psychology, physics, and instinct. The language has changed, but the relationship has not. Even the idea of a spark as the beginning of something new continues to resonate in countless contexts. A new idea begins as a spark. Innovation begins as a spark. Inspiration, conflict, desire, ambition, all described with the language of flame. These metaphors are so deeply embedded in culture that people rarely question their origins, yet they carry the imprint of a time when fire explained the world. They carry the imprint of a god whose influence was once taken for granted. Gibil means something to people today because fire still means something. The quiet warmth of a candle, the steady flame of a stove, the fierce heat of a forge, the controlled burn that protects forests, the small light used to honour memories, all reflect the same ancient relationship humans once formalized through myth. The stories may be forgotten, but the connection remains. This realization brings a kind of calm. It connects modern experience to ancient continuity. It shows that even in a world defined by technology, people still respond to the same elemental truths. They still seek light in darkness. They still gather around warmth. They still rely on transformation. They still respect forces that can create and destroy with equal ease. Gibil's memory burns quietly in these instincts, not as a figure of worship, but as a reminder of humanity's earliest achievements. The fire that once needed constant protection now burns in controlled environments, but the partnership remains. People still tend flames, still learn from them, still feel comfort in their presence, still shape the world with their help. And so the story of Gibil does not end in loss. It ends in continuity. Quiet, steady, unbroken. A warm light that persists through ages, glowing in the background of daily life, shaping the way people think, create, and understand the world. And the flame that once lit ancient workshops and kitchens now appears in different forms, but its meaning hasn't changed. It still offers clarity. It still offers warmth. It still transforms. And in those moments, whether people recognize it or not, they stand in the presence of the same elemental force that inspired the earliest myths. a force that still carries the memory of a god whose warmth has never truly faded.